On Father's Day, my daughter and her husband gave me a pair of gold-framed reading glasses. I brought them to lunch 3 days later. A man took one look at them and went completely pale. He gripped the frames and whispered that I needed to call the police immediately. I said nothing. But 5 days later, my family discovered the true cost of their betrayal. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Oliver. I am 70 years old and a retired systems engineer. I spent my life building things that last, but what I am about to tell you is how I meticulously dismantled my own family. The diner was loud, filled with the clatter of silverware and the heavy scent of roasted coffee. I sat across from my oldest friend, Felix. Felix and I grew up together in the same neighborhood, sharing the same struggles and the same triumphs as two African-American men navigating a world that demanded twice the effort for half the credit. Felix spent 30 years as a corporate security specialist, sniffing out corporate espionage and securing data for massive companies. We were just two old men enjoying a Tuesday lunch discussing the upcoming golf season. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the Father's Day gift I had received from my daughter Kendra and her white husband Brent. They were heavy gold-framed reading glasses. Brent had handed them to me with a smug, self-satisfied grin, claiming he had specially ordered them from a boutique in Europe to help with my failing eyesight. I unfolded the arms and slid them onto my face, looking down at the laminated diner menu. Felix was in the middle of a story about his golf swing, but his voice suddenly caught in his throat. He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes locked onto the bridge of my new glasses. The easygoing smile vanished from Felix's face, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a man who hunted corporate spies for a living. He leaned across the table and his voice dropped to a barely audible register. He asked me to take the glasses off and hand them to him slowly. I did as he asked, placing the gold frames on the worn table. Felix picked them up and turned them toward the natural light streaming through the window. He pointed to a microscopic dark speck embedded right in the center of the bridge, a spot anyone else would assume was just a decorative rivet. He told me it was a pinhole camera. He then ran his thick thumb along the right arm of the frame, feeling a slight unnatural bulge in the metal casing. He looked me dead in the eye and stated that there was a micro-transmitter hidden inside. The glasses were a live streaming surveillance device equipped with a high-definition lens and a continuous audio bug. The ambient noise of the diner faded into a dull hum as the reality of his words crashed over me. My own daughter and her arrogant, desperate husband were spying on me. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. Brent had lost his job in corporate finance 6 months ago, but continued driving a luxury car and wearing expensive suits. He always treated me with a thin veneer of respect, masking a deep-seated entitlement, viewing me as a relic of the past. Kendra, my own flesh and blood, had been acting strangely anxious, constantly asking about my financial plans. They thought I was just a retired old man living on a modest pension. They did not know about the offshore trust I established decades ago after selling a revolutionary software patent. They thought my mind was fading. They wanted to monitor my every move, my every keystroke, my every password. They wanted to steal my legacy. Felix pushed the glasses back across the table. He told me we needed to call the police right now and file a report for illegal surveillance and elder abuse. I looked at the gold frames shining under the harsh diner lights. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or express a single ounce of hot anger. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. Calling the police would end the game too quickly. It would allow them to hire lawyers, play the victims, and claim it was a misunderstanding born out of concern for my health. I refused to give them that luxury. I picked up the glasses, calmly folded the arms, and slid them deep into my breast pocket, ensuring the camera lens was smothered in absolute darkness. I looked at Felix and instructed him to finish his coffee and talk about the weather. I told him to act completely normal because the silent counterattack had just begun. Brent and Kendra wanted to play a game of surveillance and deception. I decided in that exact moment to give them a performance that would utterly destroy their lives. I would not just cut them off. I would let them dig their own graves using their own boundless greed as the shovel. We finished our lunch making casual conversation while a storm of calculation raged behind my eyes. I drove back to my house with the glasses still buried in my pocket. The moment I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, I found Brent waiting for me. He was pacing the hardwood floor, his face flushed and a sheen of sweat coating his forehead. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. He did not ask how my lunch was. He did not ask how I was feeling. His eyes darted directly to my face and he aggressively demanded to know why I had taken the glasses off. He stammered out a weak excuse claiming he was just worried about my vision and wanted to make sure the prescription was working perfectly. He was breathing heavily, his hands twitching at his sides. I looked at him and realized he had been actively watching the live feed. He had panicked the second his screen went dark. I smiled a polite, pleasant smile and told him my eyes simply needed a rest from the new lenses. The trap was officially set and he had no idea he had already stepped inside. Brent stood rigidly in the foyer when I stepped through the front door. The tension radiating from his body was almost suffocating. He stared intensely at the breast pocket of my jacket where the gold frames were tucked safely away. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression vacant, playing the part of a tired old man who had no idea he was standing in the same room as a predator. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the glasses, and examined them with a gentle sigh. I told Brent they were a beautiful gift, but the prescription felt just a little too strong. I complained that they gave me a sharp headache right behind my eyes after only an hour of use. The transformation in Brent was instantaneous. His shoulders dropped and the frantic energy in his eyes dissolved into profound relief. He let out a nervous laugh, wiping the sweat from his brow. He quickly closed the distance between us, wrapping a heavy arm around my shoulder in a grotesque display of fake affection. He told me it takes time for older eyes to adjust to premium European lenses. His tone shifted from panicked to aggressively persuasive. He guided me toward the living room, pointing to the stack of unopened mail on the mahogany console table. He insisted I put them back on right now to sort through the envelopes, claiming I needed to push through the initial discomfort to train my eyes. I looked at the mail and then at Brent. He was practically vibrating with impatience. He needed that camera back online. He needed to see what I was seeing. I nodded slowly, offering him a grateful smile that masked the absolute disgust I felt. I unfolded the arms of the glasses and slid them back onto my face. The world through the lenses was sharp and clear, but I knew an invisible digital eye was tracking my every movement. I picked up the stack of mail, shuffling through bills and advertisements with trembling hands. I purposely slowed my movements, adopting the slight hesitation of a man whose cognitive sharpness was fading. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kendra walk into the foyer, joining her husband. My daughter stood next to Brent, watching me with a cold, calculating gaze that broke whatever was left of my paternal heart. There was no love in her posture. There was only raw, unadulterated greed. I gathered the letters and mumbled that I needed to file some important documents in my home office. I walked down the hall, leaning heavily on the walls, dragging my feet just enough to sell the performance. As I closed the heavy oak door of my office, I caught a glimpse of their shadows lingering right outside the frosted glass. They were hovering like vultures, waiting for a meal. I walked over to my heavy oak desk and sat down in the leather chair. I knew exactly what they were looking for. Years ago, I had casually mentioned to Kendra that the bulk of my wealth from the tech patent was secured in an offshore trust. I never gave her the location, the bank name, or the account numbers. I always told her the lawyers would handle it when my time came. But Brent was desperate, and his desperation had clearly infected my daughter. They wanted those account numbers before my time came. They wanted to drain the trust while I was still breathing. I picked up a stack of old utility bills and stared at them, making sure the camera on the bridge of my glasses had a clear, unobstructed view of my hands. I needed them to believe I was doing my regular monthly bookkeeping. I took a deep breath, letting the silence of the room settle around me. It was time to give them exactly what they were hunting for. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the Persian rug covering the center of the office floor. I slowly rolled the heavy fabric back, revealing a steel combination dial embedded in the hardwood. It was a decoy floor safe I had installed 5 years ago to hold duplicate insurance papers and emergency cash. I knelt on the floor, groaning slightly to emphasize my age, and slowly turned the dial. I made sure my head was angled perfectly downward, allowing the pinhole camera to capture every single click of the combination lock. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside, sitting right on top of a stack of old tax returns, was a crisp white document. It was a fabricated bank statement I had printed months ago when I was organizing my estate planning. It was just a hypothetical projection sheet I used to calculate potential interest yields. But to an untrained, greedy eye, it looked like an official offshore portfolio summary. I pulled the document out and held it up to the bright overhead light. The numbers were printed in bold black ink, showing a liquid cash balance of exactly $3 million. I stared at the paper for a long, unbroken minute, keeping my head perfectly still. I ran my index finger directly under the fake routing numbers and the fake account identifiers, tracing them slowly as if I were verifying the digits. I knew Brent was on the other side of the door, staring at his phone screen, screenshotting every single pixel. I folded the fabricated statement, placed it back into the decoy safe, and locked the heavy steel door. I rolled the Persian rug back into place and stood up, rubbing my lower back. I took the gold-framed glasses off my face, rubbing my eyes as if the headache had returned. I placed them carefully on the desk, ensuring the lens was pointed harmlessly at the ceiling. I walked quietly toward the office door, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As I reached for the brass handle, I heard a frantic, hushed voice echoing from the hallway. I paused, pressing my ear against the cool wood. It was Brent. His voice was breathless, vibrating with a manic adrenaline. He was whispering rapidly into his cell phone, speaking to someone on the other end of the line. I heard him say clearly that he had the routing numbers and the account details. He laughed, a short, sharp sound of pure, desperate triumph. He told the person on the phone that the old man was sitting on $3 million in liquid cash. Then he uttered a sentence that sealed his fate completely. He whispered that they could drain the entire account by tomorrow morning. I woke up before the sun breached the horizon. The house was dead quiet. Brent and Kendra were still asleep, probably dreaming of the millions they thought they were about to steal. I dressed quickly, grabbing my car keys and slipping out the side door before either of them could intercept me and offer their fake assistance. I drove across town, the morning air crisp and clear against my windshield. I did not go to the address listed on the fake offshore statement I had planted the day before. Instead, I pulled into the private parking lot of my actual primary financial institution. I walked through the polished glass doors and was immediately escorted into the mahogany-paneled office of my longtime wealth manager, Arthur Cole. Arthur had handled my finances since I sold my software patent decades ago. He knew my voice, my habits, and my strict security protocols. As soon as I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his desk, I saw the deep lines of concern etched into his face. He did not offer me coffee or exchange pleasantries about the weather. He simply folded his hands on his desk and let out a heavy sigh. He told me he was incredibly relieved that I had come in person because something highly irregular had just occurred. Arthur opened a beige file folder and slid a piece of paper across the polished wood. It was a formal wire transfer request for $50,000. The recipient account was a high-risk offshore holding company I had never seen before. Arthur explained that my son-in-law Brent had arrived the second the bank doors opened just 1 hour ago. Brent had presented the transfer request alongside a comprehensive power of attorney document claiming I was experiencing sudden cognitive decline and needed him to manage my immediate medical expenses. I picked up the power of attorney document. My eyes scanned the heavy legal jargon until they landed on the bottom of the last page. Right there on the signature line was my name in blue ink. The looping swoop of the capital letter O and the sharp, aggressive slant of the final R were absolutely flawless. A stranger would swear I signed it myself. Even Arthur admitted the signature passed their initial visual verification protocols. But looking at that blue ink, a cold knot formed in my stomach. Brent could never replicate my handwriting with such terrifying precision. But Kendra could. The memory hit me like a physical blow. When my daughter was in high school, she used to forge my signature on her report cards and field trip permission slips. I caught her doing it once at the kitchen table, holding my old checks up to the light and tracing the curves until she perfected my exact pen stroke. Back then, I scolded her and thought it was just rebellious teenage behavior. I never imagined she would weaponize that specific skill decades later to rob her own father blind. My own flesh and blood had sat down with a blue pen and willingly signed away my autonomy to a desperate gambler. She was not a passive victim in her husband's scheme. She was the architect of my destruction. Arthur reached for his desk phone. He told me he was calling the police immediately to report felony fraud and have Brent arrested before he could leave the city limits. I reached across the desk and firmly pressed my hand down on the phone receiver, stopping him. I told Arthur that calling the authorities right now would be a massive tactical error. A $50,000 forgery was a serious crime, but Brent would just claim it was a misunderstanding or blame an aggressive legal consultant for giving him bad advice. He would walk away with a slap on the wrist, and Kendra would play the crying victim. I needed a much larger trap. I needed Brent to feel desperate enough to commit a federal offense from which there was absolutely no return. I instructed Arthur to process the transfer through the initial security gates but force a hard decline at the final clearing stage. I told him to generate an automated error code citing a temporary system failure rather than a fraud block. This would make Brent believe the money was almost his and keep him chasing the illusion. Next, I ordered Arthur to flag my entire financial profile for maximum surveillance. Every single login attempt, every ping, every transfer request originating from Brent's internet address needed to be recorded and archived by the bank security team. Arthur looked at me with a mix of awe and absolute terror. He nodded, slowly tapping his keyboard to initiate the silent block. I was not just protecting my wealth. I was building a digital cage and handing Brent the key to lock himself inside. I drove back to my house, the engine of my car humming a steady rhythm that matched my pulse. The moment I unlocked the front door, I was hit with an atmosphere thick with hostility. Brent was waiting for me in the living room, his face purple with rage. He was clutching his cell phone so hard his knuckles were stark white against his skin. The screen displayed an automated banking alert showing the declined $50,000 transaction. He did not bother hiding his attempt to access my funds. Instead, he marched right up to me, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of physical dominance. He waved the phone in my face and raised his voice, echoing through the quiet house. He aggressively stated that my finances were a complete mess and that my accounts were freezing due to my own negligence. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and raw panic. He told me that my mind was clearly slipping and that I was becoming a severe danger to my own household. With a cold, sinister smirk, he declared that it was time they intervened legally and appointed a permanent guardian to take control before I ruined everything. I did not engage with Brent. Arguing with a desperate man only validates his delusion of power. I simply stared right through him, treating his threats like the buzzing of a mild annoyance. I turned my back on his red face, grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, and walked straight into the garage. The cool air of the garage was a welcome relief from the toxic atmosphere inside the house. I walked over to my sedan, a heavy, reliable piece of machinery I had meticulously maintained for the past decade. Every oil change, every fluid flush, every tire rotation had been done exactly on schedule. It was a vehicle that represented my need for order and control. I slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors and turning the ignition. The engine roared to life with a comforting, steady purr. I pressed the garage door opener and backed slowly out into the bright morning sunlight, leaving Brent fuming in the hallway. I told myself I was just running to the hardware store to pick up some gardening supplies. But the truth was, I needed space to think. I needed to map out the next phase of my retaliation without the constant feeling of their eyes burning into my back. I drove through our quiet suburban neighborhood, the smooth ride of the sedan calming my racing thoughts. The streets were lined with tall oak trees and manicured lawns, presenting a picture of perfect domestic tranquility that starkly contrasted the war zone my own home had become. I approached the main commercial avenue where the speed limit increased and the traffic grew heavier. The main boulevard was a steep downhill incline that fed directly into one of the busiest intersections in the county. Cars and heavy commercial trucks were crossing back and forth in a relentless stream of metal. The traffic light ahead shifted from green to yellow. I eased my foot off the accelerator and applied a firm, steady pressure to the brake pedal exactly as I had done thousands of times before. But the pedal did not offer the familiar firm resistance. Instead, it plunged straight down, hitting the floor mat with a sickening hollow thud. There was no pressure, no friction, and absolutely no reduction in speed. My sedan was a heavy steel missile hurtling down a steep incline directly toward a chaotic wall of crossing traffic. My heart hammered against my ribs, but 40 years of engineering logic instantly overrode any sense of panic. I did not pump the brakes wildly. I knew immediately that the hydraulic fluid was completely gone. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, and slammed my right hand onto the gear shift. I violently downshifted from drive into the lowest possible gear. The engine screamed in protest, the RPM dial pinning into the red zone as the transmission fought to absorb the kinetic energy. The car jerked violently, the sudden deceleration throwing me hard against my seatbelt, but I was still moving too fast to avoid the crossing intersection. A massive delivery truck was passing right through my lane, blaring its horn in a deafening warning. I had less than 2 seconds to make a decision. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, aiming for a steep, grassy ditch that ran parallel to the intersection. The front tires jumped the curb, launching the heavy sedan into the air for a terrifying split second. The car slammed down into the muddy ditch, tearing through dense brush and snapping thick tree branches. The impact violently tossed me around the cabin, the airbags deploying with a concussive blast that filled the interior with white smoke and the sharp smell of burnt powder. The sedan plowed into a thick mound of dirt and finally ground to a violent halt just 10 feet away from the rushing traffic. I sat completely stunned amidst the deploying smoke, my chest aching from the extreme force of the seatbelt. I pushed the deflated airbag aside, unbuckled my harness, and kicked my door open. I stumbled out into the damp grass, my knees shaking but miraculously unharmed. Sirens began to wail in the distance as bystanders immediately called emergency services. Within 20 minutes, the chaotic scene was swarming with local police officers and a heavy-duty tow truck tasked with pulling my ruined sedan out of the deep ditch. I stood by the side of the road answering the officers' questions with a calm, measured tone, explaining the sudden and complete mechanical failure. The tow truck driver, a burly man covered in engine grease, hoisted the front end of my vehicle up on the winch. He slid underneath the chassis with a bright flashlight to secure the towing hooks. Suddenly, he slid back out, wiping his hands on a dirty rag, and waved me over. He pointed a greasy finger directly at the underbelly of the car near the front driver's side wheel. He told me he had seen a lot of blown brake lines in his 30 years on the job, but he had never seen one that looked like this. I crouched down and followed the beam of his flashlight. The thick reinforced rubber hose carrying the vital hydraulic brake fluid had not ruptured from age or split from sudden pressure. It was sliced completely in half with a perfectly clean edge. Someone had taken a heavy pair of wire cutters and deliberately severed the main brake line. A cold, dark realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. Brent was not just a greedy coward trying to steal my offshore trust. He had deliberately sabotaged my car. He was actively trying to kill me, or at the very least force a severe catastrophic accident to physically prove his narrative of my rapid mental decline. Just as the tow truck driver pointed out the severed line, a familiar silver SUV screeched to a halt on the shoulder of the road. Kendra threw her door open and ran toward the accident scene. She did not ask if I was hurt. She did not look at the smashed front end of my car or the deployed airbags. Instead, she burst into a theatrical display of hysterical tears, throwing her hands over her face and wailing loudly enough for every police officer to hear. She rushed right up to me and forcefully ripped my house keys and remaining car keys straight out of my trembling hands. She turned to the nearest police officer, wiping away fake tears and projecting a voice filled with manufactured despair. She loudly declared that she had warned me not to drive that morning. She told the officer I had been suffering from severe dementia episodes and had become a massive danger to the public. Pointing an accusatory finger right at my chest, she shouted that her father was far too senile to ever be trusted behind the wheel of a car again. Kendra's hysterical performance at the crash site had been brutally effective. The police officers swayed by her tears, and my silence had allowed her to drive me home, officially advising me to surrender my license voluntarily. Now I was effectively a hostage in my own house. The heavy oak doors and familiar walls, once a comfort, felt like the perimeter of a cell. The very first thing Kendra did upon walking through the door was demand my cell phone. She didn't ask. She held out her hand, her eyes hard and unyielding. She claimed I was clearly confused and needed a period of absolute rest without any external distractions. When I hesitated, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, threatening to call the officers back and have me placed under a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold for my own protection. I handed over the phone, my expression a mask of defeated compliance. I knew arguing would only give her more ammunition. Without a vehicle and without a phone, my isolation was complete. I watched her lock my phone in the kitchen drawer, realizing that my daughter had systematically stripped me of every tool I needed to defend myself. I walked slowly to my bedroom, playing the role of a broken, senile man who had finally surrendered to his own fading mind. The silence of my bedroom was broken by the sharp rustle of thick paper. Lying perfectly centered on my neatly made bed was a glossy trifold brochure. I picked it up, the heavy cardstock feeling cold against my fingertips. The cover featured an overly bright image of smiling elderly people sitting in a sunlit garden, but the bold text across the top revealed its true nature: Oakwood Secure Care Facility. It was a high-security lockdown psychiatric institution known for handling severe dementia patients who required constant physical restraint. This was not a retirement community. It was an asylum. I walked out of the bedroom clutching the brochure and found Kendra in the kitchen calmly pouring a cup of coffee. I tossed the brochure onto the granite counter. It landed with a sharp slap. I asked her, my voice steady, if she truly believed I was losing my mind, or if this was just a convenient way to get me out of the house. Kendra didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee and looked at me with an icy detachment that chilled me to the bone. She stated, her tone devoid of any familial warmth, that my accident was proof of my decline. When I told her the mechanic confirmed the brake line was cut, she let out a short, cruel laugh. She leaned across the counter and coldly declared that my paranoia about cut brakes was the exact symptom of severe dementia that necessitated Oakwood's secure ward. She told me that if I did not go voluntarily, she and Brent were fully prepared to present the police report of the accident to a judge and force a court-ordered evaluation. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, suffocating. I stared into the eyes of the woman I had raised, the woman I had sacrificed everything for, and saw nothing but a stranger. The realization was profound and devastating. This wasn't just Brent's manipulation. Kendra was a willing, active participant in my destruction. She wasn't just trying to steal my money. She was willing to lock her own father in a padded room to get it. Any lingering paternal instinct, any hope for her redemption died in that moment. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my sanity. I simply nodded silently, picking up the brochure and walking back to my room. I closed the door quietly, leaning against the cool wood. The betrayal was complete, but so was my resolve. I fully accepted that they were not my family anymore. They were enemies who needed to be dismantled with absolute prejudice. The time for observation was over. The time for total annihilation had arrived. I walked toward the master bathroom to splash cold water on my face, the silence of the house pressing down on me. As I approached the small frosted window near the shower, I heard a faint rhythmic tapping against the glass. I carefully unlocked the latch and slid the window open just an inch. A small black object was wedged into the screen. I pulled it inside. It was a cheap prepaid burner phone. Felix. He had managed to bypass their surveillance. I turned the phone on my hands, moving quickly. The screen lit up, displaying a single unread text message. I opened it and the words glowed brightly in the dim bathroom. The text from Felix read, "Brent owes $400,000 to the Vargas gambling syndicate. They gave him 1 week to pay." The text message glowed in the dim light of the bathroom, illuminating the exact depth of Brent's desperation. $400,000 owed to a violent gambling syndicate meant Brent was not just greedy, but fighting for his actual life. It explained the frantic pacing, the forged signature, and the severed brake line. He was a cornered rat running out of options, and my offshore trust was his only path to survival. Armed with this crucial motive, I knew I had to control the flow of information completely. Felix had preloaded the burner phone with several security applications, including a highly sensitive radio frequency sweeper designed to detect active transmitters. I activated the app and quietly stepped out of the bathroom, keeping my footsteps light against the hardwood floor. I moved methodically through the hallway, watching the digital meter on the screen. The signal was completely flat until I crossed the threshold into the main living room. The digital needle immediately spiked violently into the red zone, vibrating the phone furiously in my palm. The entire room was broadcasting a strong, continuous radio frequency. Brent and Kendra were not just tracking my visual movements with the glasses. They were actively listening to every breath I took inside my own home. I kept my face perfectly neutral, knowing that reacting physically could alert them if they had hidden cameras installed as well. I systematically swept the perimeter of the room, tracing the invisible waves of their betrayal, looking for the exact source of the transmission. I dropped to one knee, pretending to search for a dropped coin while sliding the phone beneath the heavy mahogany dining table. The frequency meter maxed out completely. I reached my fingers along the rough underside of the wood and felt a small square plastic casing taped securely next to the center beam. It was a military-grade audio transmitter hardwired with a long-lasting battery. I left it exactly where it was and continued my sweep to ensure the room was fully mapped. The meter spiked a second time near the large bay window. I walked over and my blood instantly turned to ice. The signal was radiating directly from the bottom of a floral-patterned armchair. It was my late wife Diane's favorite reading chair. Since she passed away, I had kept that chair pristine, refusing to let anyone sit in it. It was a sacred monument to the woman I loved, the place where she spent her final years reading and drinking her morning tea. The fact that Brent or my own daughter had crawled underneath Diane's chair to violate her memory with a cheap surveillance device pushed my cold rage into an entirely new stratosphere. They had crossed a boundary that demanded absolute ruin. Their total lack of respect for the dead mirrored their total lack of respect for the living. I stood up and took a slow, measured breath to compose myself, pushing the anger down into a tight, focused ball. I had the ultimate advantage now. I knew exactly where the microphones were, and they had no idea I was holding a secure burner phone. It was time to feed the starving rat. I stood right between the dining table and the armchair, ensuring the audio bugs would pick up every single syllable with crystal clear precision. I dialed Felix's secure number on the burner phone. When he answered, I immediately launched into a loud, panicked performance. I made my voice tremble, pitching it higher to sound like a frightened, confused old man losing his grip on reality. I shouted into the phone, telling Felix that I was terrified of losing my memory after the traumatic car accident. I paced heavily near the hidden microphones, ensuring my frantic footsteps and my desperate tone were captured perfectly by their surveillance equipment. I told Felix that I no longer trusted the complex offshore trust accounts because the passwords and security protocols were becoming far too difficult for my failing mind to remember. I crafted a narrative of pure financial vulnerability, painting a picture of an old man desperate for simplicity. I declared loudly that I had made a firm decision to liquidate the entire tech trust immediately. I told Felix I was going to the bank first thing tomorrow morning to wire all $3 million of my liquid assets directly into my standard local checking account. I explained that having all the money in one simple, easily accessible place was the only way I could feel secure about my future. I knew anyone listening would recognize the sheer vulnerability of that move. A standard checking account had virtually zero secondary security protocols, making the money instantly accessible to anyone with a simple power of attorney, a stolen debit card, or a forged check. I thanked Felix for his fake concern and ended the call abruptly. I stood in the silence of the living room, staring down at the floorboards where the bugs were hidden. The bait was dangling directly over the steel trap. All $3 million were seemingly up for grabs, and Brent had a violent syndicate breathing down his neck with a ticking clock. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and waited. It took exactly 20 minutes. The screech of tires tearing into the driveway shattered the quiet afternoon. A car door slammed shut with incredible force. Heavy, desperate footsteps pounded up the front porch before the front door burst open. Brent stumbled into the foyer, gasping for air, his chest heaving under his sweat-soaked shirt. He had clearly broken multiple traffic laws, rushing back to the house to intercept my plan. He spotted me in the kitchen and immediately forced a wide, unnatural smile, trying to mask his heavy panting. He walked toward me, holding his hands up in a gesture of fake surrender and overwhelming support. He told me he had been thinking about my car accident and felt terrible that I was stuck at home without transportation. He practically begged me to let him be a good son-in-law. He insisted that he would cancel all his important meetings tomorrow so he could safely escort me to the bank and help me manage whatever financial errands I needed to handle. Brent's manic performance in the kitchen confirmed everything I needed to know. I offered him a grateful nod, playing the part of the relieved elderly father, and dismissed myself to my bedroom under the guise of needing to rest before tomorrow's highly anticipated bank trip. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, severing their prying eyes from my immediate physical space. I knew I had baited the trap perfectly, but the timeline was accelerating faster than I had anticipated. A cornered animal strikes unpredictably, and Brent was completely out of options. I walked over to my heavy oak dresser, deciding it was time to secure the few irreplaceable items I had left in this house. The bottom drawer contained a solid mahogany jewelry box. Inside rested Diane's diamond necklace, a flawless vintage piece I had purchased for our 30th wedding anniversary. It was not just a valuable financial asset, it was the physical embodiment of my late wife's elegance and our shared history. I reached for the brass handle, intending to transfer the necklace into my hidden floor safe for ultimate protection. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and the handle simply gave way. The heavy brass lock had been violently forced open, its internal mechanism sheared completely in half by a heavy tool. I pulled the drawer open, and my heart turned to stone. The velvet-lined mahogany box was lying open. The deep blue fabric was entirely bare. The diamond necklace was gone. A cold, sterile silence filled the room. The violation was absolute. They were no longer waiting for me to die or make a financial mistake. They were actively plundering my home, stealing the very memories of the woman who gave them life. I did not scream or throw the empty box across the room. Emotional outbursts are for the weak, and I had completely shed my vulnerability. I walked calmly to my walk-in closet, pushing aside a row of heavy winter coats to access a hidden digital control panel flush against the drywall. 5 years ago, when I hired a team of private contractors to remodel the master bathroom, I installed a closed-circuit security camera disguised as a smoke detector directly above the dresser. It was a paranoid measure at the time meant to keep honest workers honest. Today it was the ultimate instrument of my vengeance. I tapped in my passcode and the small high-definition screen flickered to life. I scrubbed through the time-stamped archives, rewinding the footage to the exact window of time when I was stranded at the auto shop dealing with my sabotaged brakes. The black and white video fed the brutal truth directly into my veins. The screen showed my own daughter Kendra creeping into my bedroom with a heavy flathead screwdriver gripped tightly in her right hand. I watched the woman I raised drive the metal wedge into the brass lock of the dresser drawer, throwing her entire body weight against the handle until the mechanism snapped with a violent jerk. She opened the drawer, snatched the mahogany box, and ripped the diamond necklace from its velvet resting place. She did not hesitate. She did not look remorseful. She stuffed her mother's diamonds into her pocket just as Brent walked into the frame. He was pacing nervously, chewing his fingernails, checking his phone every 2 seconds like an addict waiting for a fix. Kendra pulled the necklace out and shoved it directly into his chest. The stark monochrome footage captured the raw transactional nature of their marriage. She was willingly funding his survival with the absolute desecration of her own family. I synced the audio feed from the hidden camera, leaning in close to hear their exchange. Brent grabbed the necklace, his eyes wide with a frantic manic energy. His voice cracked as he inspected the diamonds. He told Kendra that the stones were flawless and that pawning them immediately would buy them exactly 3 days of grace with the debt collectors. 3 days. The timeline was no longer an abstract threat. The Vargas gambling syndicate was closing in rapidly, and Brent was treating my house like a liquidation sale to save his own skin. He kissed Kendra quickly, a gesture utterly devoid of romance, and sprinted out of the room with my wife's legacy stuffed in his pocket. The danger was not approaching anymore. It was already standing inside my walls. Desperate men do desperate things when their time runs out, and Brent had precisely 72 hours before violent criminals came to collect his life. I connected my secure burner phone to the hidden control panel. With a few rapid keystrokes, I downloaded the entire high-definition video and audio file, routing it directly to a heavily encrypted offshore cloud server Felix had set up for me. The physical hard drive in my closet could burn, but the indisputable evidence of their grand larceny was now immortalized in the digital ether. The theft of the necklace gave me the criminal leverage I needed to destroy them permanently. I locked the control panel, secured the closet, and walked out of the bedroom. The house smelled faintly of peppermint and ginger. I moved down the hallway and stepped into the kitchen. Kendra was standing by the marble island, stirring a steaming mug with a silver spoon. She looked up, offering me a bright, artificial smile that made my stomach turn. She told me she had brewed a special herbal tea designed to calm my nerves and help my failing memory focus before my big trip to the bank tomorrow. She pushed the ceramic mug across the counter toward me, her eyes wide with fake filial devotion. I stepped closer, reaching for the warm handle. As I looked down at the dark liquid, I noticed something completely unnatural. Clinging to the dark ceramic rim of the mug just above the surface of the tea was a fine, powdery white residue. It was not sugar, and it was not sweetener. It was a heavy pharmaceutical sediment improperly dissolved. She was not trying to comfort me. She was trying to drug me. Kendra pushed the ceramic mug across the smooth granite counter, letting her fingers linger on the handle. Her smile was a masterclass in deception, radiating a sickeningly sweet warmth that completely masked the lethal intent beneath. She insisted in a voice dripping with manufactured concern that the special herbal blend would clear the fog from my failing memory and calm my nerves before the strenuous trip to the bank. I looked past her shoulder and saw Brent leaning against the arched doorway of the kitchen. He was watching me with the unblinking intensity of a starved predator tracking wounded prey. His arms were crossed over his chest, his jaw tight, waiting for me to consume the poison they had carefully prepared. They had planned this down to the very last detail, calculating that a sedated, confused old man would be infinitely easier to manipulate during whatever grand theft they had scheduled for the morning. I stared at the fine white residue clinging to the rim of the mug. The audacity of their scheme was almost breathtaking. They were executing a chemical assault inside my own home, relying entirely on my presumed compliance and paternal trust. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the warm ceramic, offering Kendra a slow, hesitant nod to maintain the illusion of my cognitive decline. I thanked her for her constant care, letting my voice tremble just a fraction of an inch to sell the performance. Brent shifted his weight in the doorway, a smirk of premature victory flashing across his face. He believed he had won. He believed I was seconds away from voluntarily drinking a heavy pharmaceutical sedative that would strip away my remaining physical and mental defenses, leaving me utterly helpless. I lifted the mug halfway to my lips, buying precious time calculating my exact next move with the cold precision of a machine. The sharp, sudden chime of the front doorbell shattered the heavy tension suffocating the kitchen. Brent flinched his head, snapping toward the foyer like a startled animal. A loud, heavy knock followed, echoing rapidly through the hallway. A delivery driver shouted through the thick oak door, demanding an immediate physical signature for a certified overnight package. Brent cursed under his breath, deeply frustrated by the unpredictable interruption to their flawless plan. He pushed off the doorframe and marched angrily toward the entryway, leaving his half-empty, identical gray coffee mug resting dangerously close to the edge of the kitchen island. Kendra instinctively turned her head toward the hallway, her attention momentarily hijacked by the sudden loud commotion at the front door. It was a microscopic window of opportunity, a fleeting fraction of a second where their surveillance grid completely collapsed. I did not hesitate or second-guess my actions. 40 years of high-stakes engineering had wired my brain to execute complex physical maneuvers under extreme pressure. In one fluid practice motion, I slid my poisoned mug directly across the polished granite and grabbed Brent's identical gray mug, bringing it instantly to my chest. I pushed my tainted herbal tea perfectly into the exact spot where his coffee had been resting, matching the handle angle identically. The physical exchange was entirely silent, seamless, and devastatingly precise. I brought Brent's untainted coffee to my lips just as Kendra turned back to face me. I swallowed a large gulp of the bitter black liquid, letting out a satisfied sigh, as if I were enjoying her highly toxic special blend. Kendra beamed her eyes, lighting up with dark validation as she watched me apparently consume the heavy sedative. Brent marched back into the kitchen moments later, tossing a flat cardboard envelope onto the counter with a harsh, irritated huff. He grabbed the poisoned mug from the edge of the island, completely oblivious to the lethal switch. He was far too consumed by his impending deadline with the violent gambling syndicate to notice the slight difference in the liquid volume or the white powdery residue clinging to the opposite rim. He raised the mug to his mouth and downed the remaining contents in 2 massive, greedy gulps, swallowing his own destruction. I sat completely still, nursing my stolen coffee, watching the pharmaceutical trap spring shut on the very man who had built it. The kitchen fell into a tense, expectant silence. Kendra hovered near the stainless steel sink, pretending to wash a few plates while throwing covert, eager glances in my direction. She was actively waiting for my eyes to glaze over, waiting for my posture to slump, waiting for my mind to surrender to the heavy chemical restraints she had served me. I played my part flawlessly to run out the clock. I sat at the island, blinking slowly, letting my shoulders droop, feigning a mild, creeping lethargy. Brent paced the hardwood floor, checking his luxury watch every 30 seconds, his manic, desperate energy driving him relentlessly forward toward his stolen millions. But biology bows entirely to chemistry, and the pharmaceutical-grade sedative they had illegally procured was incredibly potent. Exactly 20 minutes after Brent drained the poisoned mug, his frantic pacing abruptly ceased. He stopped dead in the middle of the kitchen, staring blankly at the stainless steel refrigerator as if he had forgotten where he was. A heavy, confused groan escaped his lips. He raised a trembling hand to his forehead, rubbing his temples violently as if trying to physically crush a sudden massive migraine. His knees buckled instantly, betraying his entire body weight. His eyes rolled back into his skull, exposing the whites in a terrifying display of total central nervous system failure. Brent collapsed like a heavy marionette, with its strings brutally severed, hitting the solid hardwood floor with a deafening, bone-rattling thud. He did not put his hands out to brace for the impact. He simply went down dead weight, his limbs splayed out at unnatural, awkward angles, completely paralyzed by the massive dose of tranquilizers meant for my bloodstream. Kendra dropped a glass plate into the sink, shattering it instantly into a dozen jagged pieces. She let out a piercing, guttural scream and dropped to her knees beside her comatose husband. She grabbed Brent by the shoulders, shaking his limp, heavy frame violently, but he remained entirely unresponsive, a drooling, paralyzed shell of a man. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, completely consumed her every feature. Her flawless, composed facade disintegrated completely, leaving behind a terrified, desperate amateur who realized she had just lost her only conspirator. She scrambled frantically for her cell phone, her fingers slipping wildly against the glass screen as she dialed a contact from her favorites list. She pressed the phone to her ear, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The second the call connected, she shrieked into the receiver, abandoning any semblance of secrecy, discretion, or control. She yelled that everything was completely ruined, and that the corrupt doctor was arriving in exactly 10 minutes to conduct the official mental evaluation for the court order. She stared at Brent's unconscious body, her voice cracking into a loud, hysterical sob that echoed off the kitchen walls. She screamed into the phone that the evaluation was a disaster because Brent had just chugged the entire massive dose of the heavy sedative meant to incapacitate her father. Kendra slammed the phone down onto the granite counter, severing the connection in a state of absolute panic. She stared at Brent's massive, unmoving form splayed across the hardwood floor. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, signaling the imminent arrival of their paid medical professional. She grabbed her husband under the armpits, grunting heavily as she dragged his dead weight across the kitchen tiles. His expensive leather shoes squeaked loudly against the polished wood, leaving long, dark scuff marks in their wake. I remained perfectly still at the kitchen island, sipping my coffee, watching her desperate struggle with detached amusement. She managed to haul his limp body into the narrow hallway coat closet, shoving him roughly among the winter jackets and heavy boots. She slammed the louvered door shut just a fraction of a second before the sharp chime of the front doorbell echoed through the house. Kendra wiped the sweat from her forehead, smoothed her disheveled hair, and plastered a sickeningly fake smile of worried devotion across her face. She pulled open the heavy oak door to reveal a man who looked less like a medical professional and more like a high-priced defense attorney. He wore a tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, a heavy gold watch, and a slick, artificial smile. He carried a sleek leather clipboard, gripping it tightly as he stepped over the threshold. He did not ask about Brent's absence or the scuff marks on the floor. He simply locked his cold, predatory eyes on me, sitting quietly in the kitchen. He introduced himself as Dr. Vance, a specialist in cognitive decline, stating he was here to conduct a mandatory mental health assessment to ensure my absolute safety. Dr. Vance did not bother with a standard physical examination or basic medical pleasantries. He strode purposefully into the kitchen, pulling out a bar stool and sitting directly across from me at the granite island. He clicked an expensive silver pen and immediately launched into a psychological ambush. He began firing off a barrage of highly manipulative leading questions deliberately designed to elicit confusion, frustration, or aggressive combativeness. He asked me why I had been acting so violently toward my loving daughter, recently fabricating scenarios about me throwing objects and wandering the neighborhood at night in a state of severe delirium. He spoke in a slow, condescending tone, over-enunciating his words as if speaking to a toddler who could not comprehend basic instructions. He asked me to explain why I had irrationally cut the brake lines of my own vehicle to stage a horrific accident, questioning my entire grip on objective reality. I did not raise my voice or take the bait. I folded my hands neatly on the counter and locked my gaze with his. I answered every single question with terrifying, absolute precision. I dismantled his fabricated scenarios using sharp, flawless logic, citing exact dates, times, and the specific mechanical physics of severed hydraulic brake lines. When he attempted to confuse me with complex, rapid-fire cognitive memory tests involving backward counting and spatial reasoning, I executed them flawlessly. I recited historical dates, complex mathematical equations, and the specific legal statutes regarding involuntary psychiatric holds in our state. I systematically tore down the foundation of his evaluation, proving without a shadow of a doubt that my cognitive function was not just intact, but operating at the high-functioning level of a master systems engineer. Kendra paced nervously behind him, her face growing paler with every perfectly articulated sentence I delivered. Doctor. Vance gripped his silver pen tighter, his slick, confident demeanor slowly cracking under the weight of my unyielding intellect. He tried to pivot his strategy, suggesting that my hyper-articulate responses were a clear sign of manic paranoia, trying to frame my high intelligence as a symptom of a dangerous psychological break. He wrote furiously on his leather clipboard, determined to manufacture a clinical reason to declare me a threat to myself and others, so Kendra could seize immediate control of my entire estate. I decided the medical evaluation had gone on long enough. It was time to completely terminate this fraudulent clinical theater. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool granite counter, bridging the physical distance between us. I lowered my voice into a dangerous, quiet register, forcing Dr. Vance to stop writing and look me directly in the eye. I casually mentioned that I had a deep appreciation for medical professionals, especially those who managed to maintain their lucrative private practices after settling 3 separate sealed malpractice lawsuits in the past 4 years. The color instantly drained from Dr. Vance's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored pinstripe suit. I did not stop. I detailed the exact dates of the confidential settlements, naming the specific pharmaceutical companies that were currently funneling him illegal prescription kickbacks in exchange for pushing heavy sedatives onto vulnerable elderly patients. I cited the exact routing numbers of the offshore shell companies he used to hide the illicit funds, information my retired security specialist friend Felix had effortlessly extracted from the dark web just 2 days prior. I told Dr. Vance that my memory was so incredibly sharp that I had already forwarded a comprehensive dossier of his criminal financial activities to the State Medical Board and the Federal Fraud Task Force, pending automatic release if a single fraudulent document bearing my name was ever filed with any court in the country. Dr. Vance stopped breathing entirely. The expensive silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the hard granite countertop. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing he had walked blindly into a highly orchestrated federal trap. He dropped his leather clipboard onto the floor, completely abandoning his fraudulent assignment and his lucrative payday. He scrambled backward off the bar stool, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather shoes, and sprinted down the hallway like a frightened animal. He ripped open the front door and fled the property, running toward his luxury sedan as if his very life depended on it. He did not look back. He did not say a single word of farewell to Kendra. He simply vanished, leaving the heavy oak door swinging wide open in his frantic wake. The silence in the kitchen was absolute and deafening. Kendra stood frozen by the stainless steel sink, staring at the empty doorway in total shock. The realization that her carefully constructed medical coup had just disintegrated before her eyes shattered her completely. Her facade of the caring, concerned daughter evaporated instantly, revealing the monster hiding underneath. She turned slowly to face me, her features twisting into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists, and her mask finally dropped, completely exposing her true, desperate nature. Kendra stood trembling in the center of the kitchen, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. The silence left behind by the fleeing doctor was shattered as she lunged forward, slamming her fists against the granite island. She screamed that I had ruined everything she worked for. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing off the high ceilings as she threatened to call the police right that very second. She shrieked that she would tell the authorities I had violently assaulted her husband and forced him to ingest a lethal dose of heavy narcotics. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest, declaring that my age would not save me from a felony assault charge. She was banking on the arrogant belief that the police would automatically side with a hysterical, crying daughter over a supposedly senile old man. I did not flinch or offer a single word of defense. Engaging with her delusions was a complete waste of breath. I simply looked at her with a cold, detached pity, realizing she was completely oblivious to the security cameras I had installed years ago that recorded her swapping the mugs. I turned my back on her frantic screaming, walked calmly down the hallway, and stepped into my home office. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me and engaged the solid brass deadbolt. The sharp click of the lock silenced her muffled threats from the other side of the house. I was completely isolated in my sanctuary, leaving Kendra to deal with the unconscious dead weight of her husband currently stuffed inside the hallway coat closet. Sitting at my mahogany desk, I knew the clock was ticking faster than ever before. Brent would eventually metabolize the massive dose of sedatives and wake up from his chemically induced coma. When he realized their grand medical coup had completely failed and that he was still staring down a $400,000 debt to a violent gambling syndicate, his desperation would rapidly mutate into extreme physical violence. He would not hesitate to use brute force to extract my bank details. It was time to deliver the final kill shot. I opened my encrypted laptop and initiated a secure connection to Felix. My old friend had spent decades working alongside federal cybercrimes divisions, and his network of government contacts was vast and highly specialized. I requested access to a very specific digital asset. I needed a federal honeypot. In the high-stakes world of international cybersecurity, a honeypot is a fabricated digital environment explicitly designed to attract and trap malicious actors. Felix routed my request through a secure backchannel to an active task force monitoring illegal offshore wire transfers. Within 10 minutes, my screen flashed with a heavily encrypted file containing a set of active banking credentials. These were not just fake numbers. They belonged to a live, fully functional offshore account actively monitored by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and international financial regulators. It was a digital bear trap specifically engineered to catch individuals attempting to launder money to blacklisted foreign entities or sanctioned organizations. Any unauthorized user attempting to move funds out of this specific account would immediately trigger a silent alarm across multiple federal agencies, initiating an automatic trace of the originating internet protocol address. It was the ultimate bait, and Brent was starving for a way out. I needed to ensure Brent swallowed the bait whole without a single second of hesitation. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the gold-framed reading glasses. I unfolded the arms and slid them onto my face, aligning the microscopic pinhole camera perfectly with my line of sight. I pulled a fresh yellow legal pad to the center of the desk and uncapped a thick black marker. I moved with agonizing deliberation, acting like a cautious, paranoid old man documenting his most precious financial secrets. I slowly and visibly wrote down the name of a notorious offshore holding bank at the very top of the page. Beneath that, I inscribed the exact routing numbers and the heavily monitored federal honeypot account credentials Felix had just provided. I wrote the numbers large and clear, ensuring every single digit was captured in flawless high definition by the surveillance device resting on the bridge of my nose. I made sure to pause and trace the numbers with my finger, as if verifying them for my own fading memory. To sell the illusion completely, I logged into my actual computer using those fabricated details displaying a fake landing page Felix had mocked up. The screen flashed a massive available balance of exactly $3 million. I stared at the screen for a long, uninterrupted minute, giving the hidden transmitter ample time to stream the crystalline data directly to Brent's remote server. I then carefully folded the yellow paper, slipped it into my top desk drawer, and took the glasses off my face, placing them on the desk. Out in the hallway, the heavy louvered door of the coat closet banged open. Brent tumbled out onto the hardwood floor, groaning loudly as the lingering effects of the heavy sedative clouded his brain. He gripped the wall, pulling his massive frame upright, his eyes bloodshot and his head throbbing with a violent chemical hangover. The smell of winter coats and stale dust clung to his wrinkled suit. Kendra rushed to his side, frantically whispering that the corrupt doctor had fled and their entire plan to declare me incompetent was ruined. She sobbed that they were out of time and the debt collectors were going to kill him. Brent shoved her away, his panic instantly overriding his severe physical exhaustion. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his cell phone to check the surveillance application connecting to the gold-framed glasses. He opened the live feed archive, seeking any possible advantage, and froze completely. The screen displayed a crystal-clear image of my yellow legal pad bearing the offshore routing numbers and the login credentials to a $3 million fortune. The thick fog of the sedative evaporated from his eyes, instantly replaced by a blinding manic greed. A dark, desperate smile slowly spread across his pale, sweating face. The house settled into a heavy, oppressive silence long after midnight. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed a dull red reading exactly 2 a.m. I sat perfectly still in the darkness of my master bedroom, staring intently at the glowing screen of my encrypted tablet. My hidden security cameras captured every corner of the house in crisp infrared monochrome. I watched the living room feed with the detached calculation of a predator waiting for the snare to snap shut. The heavy oak door of the guest bedroom opened with a faint, agonizing creak. Brent crept out into the hallway, carrying his silver laptop under his right arm. He moved with the exaggerated stealth of a guilty man checking over his shoulder every 2 seconds. He bypassed the kitchen entirely and slinked directly into the main living room. He did not turn on the overhead lights. He simply collapsed onto the leather sofa, opening the laptop and letting the harsh blue glow illuminate his pale, sweating face. His eyes were wide with a toxic mixture of absolute terror and manic anticipation. The heavy sedative was still clearly ravaging his system, causing his hands to shake violently as he typed his password. but the crushing weight of his $400,000 debt pushed him forward through the chemical fog. He believed he was the architect of the ultimate heist, breaking into a senile old man's offshore fortune while his wife slept peacefully in the next room. He had absolutely no idea he was logging directly into a highly monitored federal trap. I took a slow, quiet breath, watching his fingers hover over the keyboard. Brent pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, holding it up to the pale light of the screen. I knew exactly what was written on that page. It was the precise sequence of routing numbers and login credentials he had captured through the gold-framed glasses earlier that afternoon. He opened a secure browser window and navigated directly to the offshore holding bank portal. He typed the fabricated username and the alphanumeric password with frantic, desperate keystrokes. He hit the enter key and the system granted him immediate access, dropping him straight into the federal honeypot. The screen flashed a massive available balance of exactly $3 million. In the infrared camera feed, I saw his jaw drop. He stared at the 9-digit figure as if it were the Holy Grail, completely blinded by the sheer volume of the fabricated wealth. He bypassed every single security warning embedded in the portal architecture. A standard banking interface would have demanded secondary authentication protocols or triggered an out-of-network device alert. The federal honeypot did none of that. It was designed to offer zero resistance, inviting the target to commit the felony wire fraud as quickly and thoroughly as possible. Brent did not question the suspicious lack of security. Driven entirely by the ticking clock of his violent creditors, he clicked over to the International Wire Transfer tab. He did not attempt to siphon a small, untraceable amount. Greed and panic obliterated any remaining sense of caution. He typed his own unlisted offshore shell account number into the destination field. He then moved to the amount box and aggressively typed a 3 followed by 6 zeros, attempting to drain the entire trust in one single catastrophic transaction. He checked the destination account number twice, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He was committing federal wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate grand larceny, all from the comfort of my leather sofa. He moved the cursor directly over the bright blue transfer confirmation button. He took one final shuddering breath and pressed down hard on the trackpad. The very second Brenda's finger clicked the transfer button, the trap slammed completely shut. The offshore portal displayed a bright green confirmation checkmark, explicitly thanking him for initiating the international wire. In the bedroom, my encrypted burner phone vibrated silently against the dark wood of my nightstand. The screen lit up, casting a sharp white glow across my face. It was an encrypted text message from Felix relaying the direct communication from his task force contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The message consisted of exactly 6 words. Bait taken. Tracing IP. Warrants incoming. The Federal Cybercrimes Division had just instantly registered a massive unauthorized attempt to funnel $3 million into a blacklisted foreign shell account. They had the exact timestamp, the precise transaction volume, and the hard internet protocol address broadcasting directly from my living room router. Brent had effectively signed his own federal indictment, locking himself into a mandatory minimum prison sentence. I stared at the short message, feeling a profound, absolute sense of vindication. There would be no civil lawsuits over stolen property. There would be no messy family court battles over my mental competence. By allowing Brent to execute his ultimate fantasy, I had escalated his petty domestic thievery into a massive national security threat. The federal government was now coming for him with the full crushing weight of the United States justice system. I turned my attention back to the tablet screen, watching the final act of his pathetic performance unfold. Brent leaped up from the leather sofa, unable to contain the explosive surge of adrenaline. He brought the laptop screen directly to his face and physically kissed the glowing confirmation page. He let out a breathless, manic laugh, spinning around in the dark living room like a man who had just conquered the entire world. He did not walk back toward the guest bedroom where his wife was sleeping. He sprinted quietly down the hallway toward the hall closet, grabbing a large black canvas duffel bag. He threw the bag onto the dining table and began wildly ripping through his coat pockets and drawers, shoving his passport, a thick stack of emergency cash, and his most expensive watches inside. He was not planning a celebratory breakfast with Kendra. The $3 million was entirely his. He was preparing to abandon the woman who had helped him orchestrate the entire theft, leaving her to face the wrath of a supposedly ruined father, while he fled the country as a newly minted millionaire. I stepped out of the shadows of my master bedroom, leaving the glowing surveillance tablet resting on the mattress. My footsteps were silent against the polished hardwood floor as I moved down the dimly lit hallway. Brent was standing at the dining room table, violently yanking the zipper of his black canvas duffel bag shut. He was moving with the erratic, frantic adrenaline of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. The heavy metallic zip echoed loudly through the quiet house, shattering the midnight silence. That sharp noise acted like an alarm clock. The guest bedroom door cracked open down the hall. Kendra stumbled out wearing a silk robe, rubbing her eyes and squinting into the darkness. She looked from my towering figure standing calmly in the doorway to her husband, frantically stuffing a passport into his leather jacket. Her face contorted into a mask of pure confusion and sudden panic. She demanded to know what was going on and why Brent was packing a bag at 3 a.m. Brent froze his hand hovering over the canvas strap. He looked at Kendra and then turned his gaze slowly toward me. The residual fog of the heavy sedative was completely gone, replaced by a toxic, overflowing arrogance. He did not look like a man caught in the middle of a midnight betrayal. He looked like a tyrant ready to claim his stolen kingdom. He stood up straight, puffing out his chest, and kicked the duffel bag off the table. It landed on the floor with a heavy thud. He told Kendra to wake up and pay close attention because the game was officially over. Brent walked slowly toward the center of the living room, closing the physical distance between us. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive jacket and pulled out a folded sheaf of thick legal paper. He waved it in the air like a victorious flag, snapping the crisp pages right in front of my face. His lips curled into a cruel, mocking smile that exposed the absolute rot of his character. He announced in a loud, triumphant voice that he had visited the county clerk office yesterday afternoon right after dropping off his fraudulent banking requests. He proudly declared that the flawless power of attorney Kendra had forged was accepted without a single question by the processing clerk. He told me he had legally transferred the deed of my house directly into his own name. He laughed a sharp barking sound that bounced off the high ceilings. He told me I was standing in his living room on his hardwood floors under his roof. Kendra gasped, stepping forward with wide, terrified eyes. She had forged the signature for the bank transfers, but the real estate theft was clearly a separate rogue project Brent had executed entirely on his own. She asked him what he meant about the house. Brent ignored his wife completely, keeping his predatory gaze locked entirely on me. He stepped so close I could smell the stale sweat and pure greed radiating from his skin. He lowered his voice into a vicious, threatening register. He ordered me to turn around, walk back into my bedroom, and pack a single small suitcase. He stated that the high-security psychiatric facility from the brochure was expecting a new patient at dawn and that my room was already booked. He told me my time as the patriarch was permanently over and that he was taking total control of the entire estate, starting with my immediate eviction. He bragged that my mind was too broken and my body too weak to put up any kind of fight against him. He commanded me to submit quietly, or he would physically drag me out of his newly acquired house and dump me on the pavement. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward or raise my hands to defend myself from his aggressive posturing. I looked at the legal papers trembling in his tight grip and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical pity. I walked right past him, completely ignoring his physical threats. I moved into the kitchen, turned on the ambient overhead light, and pulled a ceramic mug from the cabinet. I poured myself a cup of the leftover black coffee from the carafe, the dark liquid splashing loudly in the silent room. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter taste wash over my tongue. I leaned against the granite island and locked eyes with the man who thought he had just ruined my life. I told Brent in a voice as calm and steady as a ticking clock that he had made a catastrophic assumption. I instructed him to take his cell phone out of his pocket right now. I told him to open his internet browser and navigate directly to the official public database of the county property appraiser. I instructed him to type in my full name and the exact street address of the house he claimed he just stole. Brent scoffed, rolling his eyes and calling me a delusional old fool who refused to accept reality. But the absolute unshakable certainty in my tone cracked his arrogant facade. A tiny flicker of doubt crossed his face. He pulled his phone from his jacket, typing furiously onto the screen with shaking thumbs to prove me wrong. The bright glow of the phone screen illuminated Brent's face in the dim kitchen. I watched his eyes dart rapidly back and forth across the digital public records. The arrogant sneer vanished from his lips instantly. The color drained completely from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack, and his mouth opened, but no sound came out. The database did not display my name. The property was not registered to an individual citizen. It was owned entirely by an impenetrable, highly shielded corporate trust I had established 30 years ago to protect my assets from civil litigation. The simple power of attorney he submitted yesterday was legally useless against a corporate entity. The county clerk office had automatically rejected and bounced his fraudulent deed transfer during their overnight processing cycle. The thick legal papers he was clutching in his hand were completely worthless forgeries. Brent stared at the glowing screen, realizing his massive real estate coup had instantly evaporated into thin air. He owned absolutely nothing. Brent stared at the glowing screen of his cell phone, the brutal reality of the failed deed transfer washing over him in real time. The forged legal papers he clutched in his hand were suddenly nothing more than heavy, useless trash. He let them slip from his trembling fingers, watching the crisp white pages scatter haphazardly across my polished hardwood floor. But the panic in his wide, bloodshot eyes lasted only a fraction of a second before a dark, manic relief rushed back in. The physical house did not matter to him anymore. He realized he did not need a suburban property tied up in an impenetrable corporate trust when he had just successfully wired what he believed to be $3 million into an untraceable offshore shell account. He still believed with every fiber of his being that he had won the ultimate prize. He still thought he was a freshly minted millionaire. He shot me a venomous, hateful glare, silently promising that my victory regarding the real estate deed was nothing more than a trivial inconvenience. He turned his back on me and sprinted toward the dining room table where his black canvas duffel bag was resting. He grabbed the heavy nylon straps, hauling the bag violently over his shoulder. He did not look at Kendra, who was still standing in the hallway. He did not offer his wife a single word of explanation or comfort. He simply marched toward the front door, his heavy boots thudding aggressively against the floorboards, driven entirely by the desperate need to vanish before the banks opened or the local police arrived. He was executing his final exit strategy, perfectly willing to leave the burning wreckage of his crimes in his rearview mirror. Kendra stepped directly into his path, physically blocking his route to the foyer. Her silk robe billowed around her ankles as she raised her hands, her face a portrait of utter confusion and mounting terror. She demanded to know exactly where he was going with a packed bag at 3 a.m. She reminded him in a shrill, cracking voice that they were supposed to handle this entire operation together, that they were a team fighting for their shared future. She reached out and grabbed his leather jacket, her fingers digging desperately into the dark material, pleading with him to stop, put the bag down, and explain the escape plan. Brent did not slow down. He did not offer a comforting lie or a gentle excuse. The mask of the loving, stressed husband completely shattered, revealing the absolute sociopath hiding underneath. He violently ripped his arm away from her grip and shoved her hard with both hands planted firmly on her chest. Kendra flew backward, her bare feet slipping on the polished wood. She hit the floor with a sharp, painful cry, her shoulder sliding hard against the baseboard. Brent stood over her, his chest heaving, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He spat his words out like venom, aiming to cause maximum emotional damage. He called her a useful, pathetic idiot. He laughed a harsh, cruel sound that bounced off the walls, mocking her for ever believing he actually loved her or cared about their marriage. He admitted right to her face that he had only targeted her to get close to my wealth. He proudly declared that he had the $3 million secured and was leaving the country tonight. He looked down at her sobbing form and coldly explained that she was the one who had forged the bank documents, and she was the one who had physically drugged my tea. He made it explicitly clear that he was leaving her behind to face the police alone, to take the entire fall for the federal fraud and the attempted poisoning. He told her to rot in prison while he lived like a king on a tropical beach. Kendra remained on the floor, gasping for air, the brutal reality of his words striking her significantly harder than the physical blow she had just endured. She slowly turned her head and looked up at me from the ground. Her eyes were wide, filled with a horrific, devastating clarity that had arrived far too late. The delusion was completely wiped away. She had betrayed the man who raised her, protected her, and provided for her entire life, all for a greedy, violent criminal who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable tool to be discarded the second she stopped being useful. She had traded her devoted, loving father for an absolute monster, and she had absolutely nothing to show for it but a shattered life and impending felony charges. A broken, pathetic sob escaped her lips as she fully understood the sheer magnitude of her own catastrophic choices. She reached a trembling hand out toward me. a silent plea for the paternal protection she had spent the last month actively trying to destroy. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer a single word of comfort or forgiveness. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. I simply stepped right over her trembling body, my eyes locked entirely on Brent. I moved with a steady, unyielding momentum, placing myself directly between him and the heavy oak front door. I stood my ground, squaring my shoulders, transforming myself into a physical barricade. I was 70 years old, but I was not going to let this coward walk out of my house on his own terms. I stared him down, radiating a cold, absolute authority. Brent froze, realizing his escape route was completely blocked by my unmoving frame. The manic energy fueling his adrenaline began to rapidly curdle into sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked at my resolute stance and realized I was not going to simply step aside and let him vanish into the night with his stolen fortune. His eyes darted wildly around the hallway, frantically searching for an alternative exit, but the front windows were locked and the back door was entirely too far away. He was cornered like a rabid animal, and his rising desperation instantly mutated into lethal violence. He reached deep into the inner waistband of his leather jacket, his movements jerky and aggressive. My heart hammered a steady, calm rhythm as he pulled out a heavy black handgun. The sharp metallic click of the safety disengaging echoed loudly in the tense, silent air of the foyer. He raised his arm, leveling the cold steel barrel directly at the center of my chest. His hand was shaking, sweating profusely, but his dark eyes were deadly serious. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with terror and rage, demanding I immediately hand over the keys to the only working car in the driveway. The final line had been crossed, transforming a botched financial crime into a highly volatile armed hostage situation. The cold steel of the gun barrel remained fixed directly on the center of my chest. Behind Brent, my daughter let out a piercing, horrified scream that echoed off the high ceilings of the foyer. Kendra scrambled backward, sliding against the polished hardwood floor and pressing her spine against the wall as the reality of her husband turning into an armed assailant finally registered in her mind. She shrieked, begging him to put the weapon down and crying that this had gone entirely too far. Brent ignored her completely, with his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. His eyes were wide and wild and completely devoid of any rational thought. He barked the demand for the car keys again, his voice cracking with sheer adrenaline and blinding panic. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I did not plead for my life or negotiate with the armed coward standing in my hallway. I remained completely motionless. My posture was rigid and unyielding. My face was an unreadable mask of solid stone betraying absolutely zero fear. I stared down the barrel of the handgun and locked my eyes directly onto his. I could see the severe tremor in his hands and the rapid, shallow rise of his chest. He was not a hardened killer. He was a pathetic, desperate gambler holding a weapon he barely understood how to use simply because he had backed himself into a corner with absolutely no way out. The heavy silence between us stretched for a tense, excruciating moment. I slowly and deliberately reached my right hand into my trouser pocket, keeping my movements entirely visible and predictable to avoid triggering his shattered nervous system. I pulled my heavy ring of car keys from my pocket. I did not hand them to him directly. With a smooth, dismissive flick of my wrist, I tossed the silver keys across the room. They landed on the granite kitchen counter with a sharp metallic clatter. I kept my eyes locked on his shaking frame and opened my mouth to verbally dismantle every remaining ounce of his fabricated ego. I told him he was the most pathetic excuse for a man I had ever encountered. My voice was low, even, and dripping with absolute lethal contempt. I broke down his entire life systematically. I told him I knew exactly how he had cut the hydraulic brake lines on my sedan like a cowardly saboteur too afraid to face me like a man. I watched his eyes widen in pure shock as I listed every single one of his miserable crimes. I detailed how he had crawled on his hands and knees like a rat to tape cheap audio bugs underneath my dead wife's favorite armchair. I told him I had high-definition security footage of him eagerly accepting my late wife's stolen diamond necklace just to buy himself 3 pathetic days of mercy from the violent thugs he owed money to. I laid bare his catastrophic failures, pointing out that he could not even forge a simple bank document without relying on his manipulated wife to hold the pen. I verbally stripped away his expensive suits and his arrogant corporate persona, exposing the terrified, bankrupt degenerate hiding beneath. I told him he was a complete and utter failure who had to resort to drugging an elderly man's tea simply because he was too incompetent to earn a single honest dollar on his own. I made sure Kendra heard every single word detailing exactly how her husband had orchestrated the destruction of our family solely to cover his pathetic gambling debts. Brent stood frozen, his gun wavering slightly, as the crushing weight of my knowledge slammed into his fragile psyche. He realized I had been 10 steps ahead of his amateur criminal enterprise from the very beginning. The color completely drained from his face, but instead of collapsing under the weight of his exposed guilt, Brent let out a sudden, sharp burst of laughter. It was a manic, unhinged sound that scratched against the walls of the house. He threw his head back and cackled wildly, the gun dipping dangerously toward the floor as he lost his grip on reality. He looked at me with a twisted, triumphant sneer, completely consumed by the grand illusion of his own success. He shouted that my surveillance footage and my arrogant speeches meant absolutely nothing now. He waved his free hand aggressively, declaring that he had already won the ultimate prize. He proudly announced that the massive offshore wire transfer had already cleared the security protocols and that $3 million of my untraceable cash was sitting securely in his private foreign account. He bragged that the massive sum of money made him completely untouchable by the local police or any desperate lawsuit I might try to file. He believed his newfound wealth was an impenetrable shield that would grant him a permanent escape from his debts, his ruined marriage, and his criminal liabilities. He kept the weapon pointed vaguely in my direction as he backed slowly toward the kitchen, keeping a safe distance between us. He reached backward blindly, feeling along the smooth granite counter until his fingers brushed against the metal keychain. He snatched the car keys, greedily gripping them tight in his sweating fist. He told me to enjoy rotting in my empty house because he was leaving the country tonight and never looking back. Brent turned on his heel and bolted for the front door, completely abandoning his sobbing wife on the hallway floor. He threw the heavy oak door open and sprinted out into the cool night air, leaving it swinging wide on its hinges. I stood perfectly still, listening to his heavy boots pound against the concrete driveway. The engine of my sedan roared to life, cutting through the silent suburban neighborhood. The tires screeched violently against the asphalt, leaving thick black marks as he threw the car into reverse and peeled out into the street. The red taillights faded rapidly into the distance, carrying a delusional criminal directly toward his own monumental destruction. I did not chase him. I did not run to the door to shout empty threats. I simply turned around and walked back to the kitchen counter. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the secure burner phone Felix had given me. The screen illuminated my calm, composed face. I opened the encrypted messaging application and typed a single short sentence to my federal contact. I pressed send, delivering the message that read, "The rabbit is running." 5 days passed in absolute silence. I remained in my restored home, watching the gears of the federal justice system grind into unstoppable motion. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how his downfall played out, because the federal task force provided Felix with a comprehensive operational debrief. Brent had driven my stolen sedan straight across state lines, pushing the engine to its absolute limit until he crossed the border. He abandoned the vehicle in a long-term airport parking garage, leaving the keys in the ignition, and checked himself into the penthouse suite of a luxury high-rise hotel under a fabricated name. He spent those 5 days living exactly like a king on credit, treating his stolen plastic like an endless fountain of invulnerable wealth. He ordered heavily overpriced room service, drank $1,000 bottles of imported champagne, and bought tailored silk suits he believed matched his newly acquired millionaire status. He spent his hours pacing the sprawling glass-enclosed balcony, staring out over the glittering city skyline, completely convinced he had outsmarted everyone in my family. He was simply waiting out the standard international clearing period, fully expecting the $3 million to become fully accessible in his private offshore shell account by the end of the business week. He truly believed he had successfully stolen my legacy and escaped without a single devastating consequence. On the morning of the 5th day, Brent sat on the plush velvet sofa in his luxury penthouse suite, a half-empty crystal flute of champagne resting on the glass coffee table. He pulled out his brand-new secure burner phone and logged into his offshore banking application with trembling, eager fingers. He navigated directly to the main dashboard, fully expecting to see a row of zeros ready for immediate withdrawal. Instead, the screen flashed a harsh, glaring red error message that illuminated his face in the dim room. The entire $3 million balance was locked under a severe administrative freeze. A bold, flashing banner across the top of the interface stated the funds were indefinitely suspended, pending a high-level federal compliance review. Brent's smug, victorious smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of sheer, absolute panic. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he desperately dialed the direct, secure number of his shady offshore financial contact. He pressed the phone tight to his ear, his breath shallow and rapid, expecting a voice to explain away the technical glitch. He was met with a harsh, automated tone followed by a sterile, robotic voice informing him that the number had been permanently disconnected and flagged for fraudulent activity. His illicit lifeline was completely severed. The violent gambling syndicate he owed $400,000 was still actively hunting him across state lines, and now his stolen fortune was entirely inaccessible. He threw the phone across the room, watching it shatter into pieces against the polished marble floor. He paced the penthouse, running his hands through his hair, frantically trying to formulate a new escape plan. Before he could even gather his racing thoughts, a loud, heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed through the massive suite. The heavy mahogany door rattled fiercely under the sheer force of the aggressive knocking. Brent froze in his tracks, his eyes darting toward the entryway. He tried to calm his racing pulse, convincing himself it was just the hotel hospitality staff delivering his morning breakfast order. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive new shirt, took a deep, composing breath, and walked slowly toward the entrance, trying to project an aura of calm authority. He unlatched the brass deadbolt and swung the heavy door open, wearing a forced, arrogant smirk, preparing to bark an aggressive order at a room service waiter. That arrogant smirk was instantly wiped from his face forever. Instead of a silver hospitality cart, he found himself staring directly down the barrels of 8 matte black tactical assault rifles. A highly coordinated, heavily armored team of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents swarmed the penthouse, moving with terrifying speed and absolute overwhelming precision. The lead agent, a massive man in thick Kevlar body armor, grabbed Brent by the collar of his tailored shirt and violently hurled him across the luxurious foyer. Brent slammed hard, face first, against the custom wallpapered wall, knocking the wind completely out of his lungs in a sudden explosive gasp. Before he could even register the physical shock of the impact, heavy combat boots kicked his legs apart. Iron grips seized his wrists, twisting them brutally and painfully behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of tactical steel cuffs snapping tightly shut echoed through the opulent suite. Brent gasped for air, completely pinned against the drywall, his face pressed awkwardly against the cold, unyielding surface. The grand illusion of his brilliant criminal victory shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. The lead agent stepped forward, yanking Brent up roughly by his collar and spinning him around to face the devastating permanent reality of his situation. The agent did not pull out a notepad to read him minor charges related to domestic theft, elder abuse, or forging a simple civilian bank document. The federal government does not deploy heavily armed tactical breach teams for local family disputes over stolen property. The agent looked Brent dead in the eyes and formally charged him with severe multiple counts of federal wire fraud, violating direct international sanctions and attempting to actively launder $3 million to a heavily blacklisted foreign terrorist entity. Brent's knees buckled completely as the massive, crushing weight of those specific legal terms crashed down upon him. He realized in that horrifying split second that he had not cleverly hacked into a senile old man's vulnerable retirement fund. He had blindly broken into a highly secure federal honeypot, triggering the absolute highest level of national security alerts. He stared at the heavily armed agents surrounding him, finally understanding that he was not facing a messy civil lawsuit or a slap on the wrist. He was facing the rest of his natural life, rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The metallic clang of the heavy interrogation room door locking echoed with a dull, chilling finality. Brent sat alone at a scarred stainless steel table, his hands still shackled securely to a heavy iron ring bolted to the concrete floor. The walls were painted a sterile, institutional gray, devoid of windows or clocks, completely isolating him from the outside world. He took a slow, deep breath, attempting to force his racing heart into a steady rhythm. The initial physical shock of the tactical raid was beginning to wear off, and his arrogant corporate instincts were frantically trying to reboot. He smoothed the wrinkled fabric of his expensive silk shirt and squared his shoulders, preparing to charm his way out of the situation. He convinced himself this was merely a massive bureaucratic misunderstanding. When the lead federal agent stepped back into the room holding a thick manila folder, Brent immediately launched into his rehearsed defense. He projected a voice of absolute confidence tinged with a thick layer of manufactured victimhood. He smugly informed the agent that the tactical team had made a colossal error by arresting the wrong man. He claimed with a perfectly straight face that the $3 million offshore transfer was entirely initiated and executed by his elderly father-in-law. He painted a picture of a tragic domestic scenario, declaring that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and had voluntarily moved the funds in a state of deep cognitive confusion. He leaned back in his hard metal chair, flashing a condescending smile, insisting he was simply trying to secure the estate to protect his sick father-in-law from making any further catastrophic financial mistakes. He demanded his immediate release and threatened to file a massive civil rights lawsuit for false imprisonment. The lead agent did not interrupt Brent's arrogant monologue. He did not yell or slam his fists on the table to demand a confession. He allowed Brent to speak uninterrupted, letting the desperate man dig his own legal grave with every single fabricated lie. When Brent finally finished his smug declaration, the agent simply let the silence hang in the cold air. He slowly pulled a heavy black laptop from his tactical briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of the stainless steel table. He opened the screen, tapped a few keys, and turned the monitor around to face Brent directly. The agent pressed play without offering a single word of explanation. The screen flickered to life, displaying a high-definition video file. Brent stared at the monitor, expecting to see banking logs or a recorded phone call. Instead, he saw a perfectly stable first-person point-of-view recording capturing the exact interior of my home office. The video showed my hands opening the decoy floor safe and holding up the fabricated bank statement. The camera angle shifted perfectly, demonstrating that the recording device was situated right at eye level. Brent's condescending smile instantly vanished. He recognized the exact footage because he had watched it live on his own cell phone just a few days ago. The agent fast-forwarded the file, and the scene shifted to the dark living room late at night. The camera angle was slightly different now, capturing the reflection of the laptop screen bouncing off the living room window. It showed Brent's own hands hovering over the keyboard. The resolution was so incredibly sharp that every single keystroke was perfectly legible. The video showed Brent typing the specific federal honeypot credentials and executing the $3 million wire fraud while sitting on my leather sofa. The agent paused the video right on a clear, illuminated frame of Brent's face bathed in the harsh blue light of the computer screen. He coldly stated that federal cybercrimes divisions do not rely on circumstantial evidence or, he said, she said, family disputes. They rely on hard digital footprints. The agent explained that the video file was uploaded directly to a secure offshore cloud server in real time, providing absolute, indisputable proof of the exact moment the crime was committed. Brent stared at the paused frame of his own face, his mind completely short-circuiting as the sheer impossibility of the situation crushed him. The video had not been recorded by a hidden camera planted in the walls or a compromised laptop webcam. The recording was captured entirely by the microscopic lens hidden inside the bridge of the gold-framed reading glasses. The very surveillance tool Brent and Kendra had purchased, configured, and forced me to wear had been entirely weaponized against them. He realized with absolute mounting horror that I had never been an oblivious victim. I had known about the hidden camera the entire time. I had purposely worn the glasses to ensure his illegal actions were captured in flawless high definition. The agent tapped the screen, pointing to a sequence of digital overlays running along the bottom of the video file. He explained that the recording was bundled with a metadata packet that perfectly matched the Internet Protocol address of my home router, tracing the signal directly back to the exact physical location of the crime. The device Brent bought to steal my fortune had essentially generated a perfectly packaged, airtight federal conviction. He had meticulously documented his own felony. The airtight alibi he had just constructed about a senile old man transferring the money voluntarily was completely destroyed by his own high-tech espionage equipment. There was no defense attorney on earth capable of arguing against a high-definition video of the defendant committing the crime recorded by a device the defendant himself had registered and deployed. I had turned his invasive technology into a silent, unblinking witness that watched him destroy his own life. The realization struck Brent with the physical force of a speeding freight train. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He began to hyperventilate, pulling desperately at the collar of his silk shirt as the cold interrogation room suddenly felt devoid of all oxygen. His chest heaved violently while a thick layer of cold sweat beaded across his forehead and dripped down his neck. The lead agent closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed like a gunshot. He reached into his manila folder and slid a thick, dense legal document across the stainless steel table. It was a formal federal plea agreement. The agent stated with zero emotion that the charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. He advised Brent to sign the document to avoid a lengthy public trial that would only result in a much harsher penalty. Brent stared blindly at the signature line, his hands shaking uncontrollably against the heavy iron restraints. He looked up at the blank concrete wall, stripped of his pride, his money, and his future. The terrifying, undeniable truth finally completely settled into his shattered mind. The senile, fading old man he thought he was playing for a fool had flawlessly orchestrated the entire trap from the very first day. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the polished hardwood floors of my pristine living room. The oppressive toxic energy that had choked the life out of my home for months had entirely evaporated the second Brent drove my stolen sedan into federal custody. I stood in the kitchen brewing a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, savoring the absolute unbroken silence of my reclaimed sanctuary. That perfect quiet was suddenly interrupted by a weak, hesitant knocking at the heavy oak front door. I did not need to check the security cameras to know exactly who was standing on my porch. The federal task force had moved with ruthless efficiency, completely freezing every single financial asset connected to Brent's name, including the joint accounts he shared with his wife. Kendra was entirely broke, stripped of her credit cards, her luxury lifestyle, and her arrogant invincibility. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, revealing my daughter shivering in the cool afternoon breeze. Her designer clothes looked rumpled and slept in, and her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. The heavy mascara she usually wore was smeared in dark, chaotic streaks down her pale cheeks. She looked like a defeated ghost, a pathetic shell of the woman who had happily plotted to lock me inside a padded room just a few days ago. She did not barge in with her usual aggressive entitlement. Instead, she kept her eyes glued to the doormat, her shoulders slumped in a posture of complete submission. She wrapped her arms around her own waist, shivering uncontrollably as she looked up at me with tear-filled, desperate eyes. She quietly begged to come inside, claiming she had absolutely nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to. I stepped aside without saying a single word, allowing her to crawl back into the home she had actively tried to steal. Kendra shuffled into the kitchen, her movements slow and heavy, and collapsed onto one of the tall bar stools at the granite island. She buried her face in her hands and immediately launched into a theatrical symphony of loud, racking sobs. It was a masterful performance designed specifically to pierce the armor of a loving father and trigger a deep biological instinct to protect his child. She wept uncontrollably, wiping her eyes with the sleeves of her expensive, ruined silk blouse. Through her heavy tears, she began spinning a frantic, desperate narrative of absolute victimhood. She cast herself as a helpless hostage trapped in a violently abusive marriage, claiming she was entirely ignorant of Brent's massive gambling debts and his reckless offshore money laundering schemes. Her voice pitched higher, cracking with manufactured emotion as she swore on her own life that she had never wanted to hurt me. She leaned across this cool stone counter, reaching her trembling hands out toward me, begging me to understand her impossible position. She spun a wild, dramatic tale, insisting that Brent was a terrifying monster who had physically threatened her into compliance. She looked me dead in the eyes and lied with breathtaking audacity, declaring that Brent had physically forced her hand to forge my signature on the massive banking transfers. She cried harder, squeezing her eyes shut as she claimed he had stood over her in the kitchen, threatening her very life if she did not slip the heavy pharmaceutical sedative into my morning tea. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of domestic terror, casting herself as a weak, terrified woman who only went along with the grand theft to protect herself from her husband's violent rage. She sobbed that she was so incredibly sorry for betraying my trust, pleading for my forgiveness and begging me to shield her from the federal investigators currently tearing her life apart. She told me I was the only real family she had left, and that she desperately needed her father to rescue her from the nightmare Brent had created. She expected me to reach across the counter, wrap my arms around her shaking shoulders, and promise her that everything would be all right. She expected the senile, forgiving old man she had manipulated for years to simply absorb her lies and open his wallet to save her. I did not reach across the granite island to comfort her. I did not offer a single word of paternal reassurance or accept her fabricated apologies. I remained completely motionless, staring down at her pathetic performance with eyes as cold and unforgiving as Arctic ice. I let her desperate sobs echo off the kitchen walls until she finally realized I was not offering the emotional rescue she demanded. She slowly lowered her hands, looking up at me with genuine mounting confusion as my absolute silence shattered her carefully constructed victim narrative. I reached over to the edge of the counter and picked up my encrypted digital tablet. Without breaking eye contact, I tapped the screen twice, loading the specific high-definition video file I had downloaded from my hidden closet security camera. I turned the glowing screen around and placed it directly in front of her tear-stained face. The crisp, monochrome footage began to play immediately. The kitchen filled with the crisp recorded audio of Kendra laughing brightly as she drove a heavy flathead screwdriver into the brass lock of my master bedroom dresser. Kendra froze her breath, catching sharply in her throat as she watched herself eagerly rip her dead mother's diamond necklace from its velvet box. The video continued playing, her own voice echoing clearly as she enthusiastically joked with Brent about locking me inside a high-security psychiatric ward. The footage completely obliterated her desperate lies about being a terrified, helpless hostage. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was a joyful, enthusiastic architect of my destruction. She watched herself eagerly hand the stolen diamonds to her husband, a cruel, triumphant smile plastered across her face. Her jaw dropped open and the fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She realized in that exact moment that I knew absolutely everything and that her final desperate manipulation had spectacularly failed. The absolute shock paralyzed her completely, leaving her staring blankly at the dark screen of the tablet. She opened her mouth to stutter out another frantic excuse to somehow justify the horrific betrayal playing out right in front of her eyes. I did not let her speak a single syllable. I reached under the kitchen island and pulled out a medium-sized black rolling suitcase, dropping it heavily onto the polished hardwood floor right beside her stool. I had packed it myself that morning, filling it with only the cheapest, most basic clothing she had left behind in her old guest bedroom. I looked down at the woman who had happily conspired to strip me of my wealth, my freedom, and my sanity. I kept my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of any remaining familial affection. I told her the charade was permanently over and that she was no longer recognized as my daughter. I pointed a firm, unwavering finger directly toward the heavy oak front door. I informed her that she had exactly 10 minutes to take the suitcase and step off my property before I called the local authorities to have her arrested for trespassing and grand larceny. Kendra stared at the black rolling suitcase as if it were a highly venomous snake coiled on the hardwood floor. The realization that her tears held absolutely no currency with me finally penetrated her thick skull. The fragile, pitiful victim act evaporated in a split second, replaced by a vicious and explosive surge of entitled rage. She kicked the suitcase violently, sending it skidding across the polished floorboards where it crashed heavily against the wooden baseboards. She squared her shoulders, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson, and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that she was my only child, my own flesh and blood, and that I had absolutely no legal or moral right to cast her out onto the street with nothing but a bag of cheap clothes. Her voice grew increasingly hysterical, bouncing off the high ceilings as she aggressively demanded her rightful inheritance. She stomped her feet like a spoiled toddler, throwing a massive tantrum, asserting that she was entitled to half of the offshore tech trust, and that she would drag me through every civil court in the state to get her millions. In a sudden fit of blind, destructive fury, she reached across the granite kitchen island and grabbed a heavy crystal vase. She hoisted it above her head and hurled it violently against the far wall. The crystal shattered upon impact, exploding into hundreds of sharp, glittering shards that rained down across the floor. She stood panting amidst the destruction, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at my chest, screaming that I was a cruel, heartless old man who deserved to die entirely alone. I did not flinch when the heavy crystal vase exploded against the drywall. I remained perfectly seated on the bar stool, my posture completely relaxed and my hands resting calmly on the cool granite counter. I looked at the jagged shards of glass littering the floor, and then looked back up at her furious red face with an expression of absolute clinical boredom. Her screaming and her violent threats washed over me like a light breeze, carrying absolutely zero weight and commanding zero respect. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. Without breaking eye contact with the woman throwing a violent tantrum in my kitchen, I simply pressed a single pre-programmed button on the touchscreen. I slid the phone back into my pocket and waited in the heavy silence that followed her outburst. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy brass handle of the side kitchen door turned with a sharp, deliberate click. The door swung open and my longtime friend Felix stepped into the room. He was not wearing his casual golf attire. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit radiating the intimidating authority of his decades spent in high-level corporate security. He did not step into the house alone. Flanking him on either side were two fully uniformed local police officers, their hands resting casually near their heavy utility belts. They stepped over the threshold and positioned themselves squarely in the center of the kitchen, establishing an immediate and overwhelming tactical presence. Kendra froze, her arms still suspended in the air from her violent outburst. The shrill screaming died instantly in her throat, replaced by a sudden sharp gasp of sheer panic. Her eyes darted frantically from Felix to the heavy silver badges pinned to the officers' chests. The manic entitled rage drained from her body, leaving behind the cold, terrifying realization that she was completely outmatched. She stumbled backward, her bare feet crunching against the broken crystal shards, completely unaware of the small cuts forming on her heels. The sudden arrival of armed law enforcement instantly neutralized her destructive leverage. She opened her mouth to launch into another fabricated story of victimhood, but one of the officers immediately raised a stern, gloved hand, ordering her to remain entirely silent and keep her hands clearly visible. Felix stepped forward, his heavy shoes crushing the remaining pieces of broken crystal. He maintained a stoic, professional demeanor, completely ignoring her wide, terrified eyes. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope packed tightly with certified legal documents. He extended his arm and firmly pressed the packet directly against Kendra's chest, forcing her to take physical possession of it. He announced in a loud, clear voice that she was being officially served. Felix informed her that the top document was a fully authorized emergency restraining order signed by a superior court judge, explicitly barring her from coming within 500 feet of me, my property, or any of my financial institutions. He pointed to the second document, stating it was a formal and immediate eviction notice, terminating her residency in my home with extreme prejudice. He then delivered the final devastating blow. He instructed her to turn to the very last page of the thick packet. He explained that it was a certified legal amendment to my offshore corporate trust. I had formally and irrevocably disowned her, severing every single biological and legal tie between us. She was permanently removed as a beneficiary, entirely stripped of her status, and completely cut out of the $3 million fortune. She was legally entitled to absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes inside the black rolling suitcase. She stared down at the dense legal text, trembling violently, as the monumental consequences of her extreme greed slammed into her reality. The immense multi-generational wealth she had taken for granted her entire life had just been legally incinerated in front of her eyes. The two uniformed police officers stepped forward, flanking Kendra on both sides. They did not ask her if she was ready to leave. They firmly grabbed her by the arms, hauling her away from the kitchen island and marching her forcefully toward the front entryway. One officer grabbed the black rolling suitcase, dragging it behind them as they physically escorted her out of the house. Kendra began to thrash and sob loudly, her bare feet dragging against the polished hardwood floor. She screamed my name, begging for a second chance, pleading for just a fraction of the money she had thrown away. I stood in the doorway, watching her being forcefully marched down the long concrete driveway. The cool afternoon wind whipped through her disheveled hair as the officers directed her toward the street. Right before she reached the curb, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. Her tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute devastation. She stared at the sprawling brick house and the unmoving figure of the father she had betrayed, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of her monumental failure. She had traded a life of guaranteed generational wealth and unconditional love for a manipulative bankrupt criminal and a future of absolute desperate poverty. The police ordered her to keep moving, leaving her standing completely alone on the edge of the asphalt. The morning air was sharp and biting as I drove away from the pristine silence of my suburban neighborhood. The chaotic events of the previous day had completely cleansed my home of its toxic occupants, but one critical piece of my life remained missing. Diane's diamond necklace was still resting in the hands of a stranger. I navigated my heavy sedan toward the gritty industrial sector of downtown, where the polished glass of corporate high-rises surrendered to cracked concrete and graffiti-stained brick. The pawn shop sat wedged between a boarded-up liquor store and a decaying laundromat. Heavy wrought iron bars protected the grimy front windows, casting harsh diagonal shadows across the displays of cheap watches and stolen electronics. The The street-level desperation was palpable, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity Diane carried throughout her entire life. I parked directly in front of the shop, turning off the ignition and taking a steady, composing breath. I stepped out onto the cracked pavement, pushing the heavy, reinforced glass door open. The sharp chime of a small brass bell announced my arrival, slicing through the stale air that smelled of old dust and cheap cigar smoke. The interior was dimly lit, illuminated mostly by flickering fluorescent tubes buzzing angrily overhead. Glass display cases formed a fortified perimeter separating the desperate customers from the man holding the cash. I walked with slow, measured steps toward the primary counter, keeping my posture rigidly straight and my expression entirely unreadable. I was not a victim seeking a favor. I was a man coming to reclaim his stolen property. The man standing behind the scratched glass counter matched the bleak aesthetic of his establishment perfectly. He was a heavy-set man with a receding hairline and a thick gold chain resting against his collarbone. He leaned heavily against the cash register, wiping down a tarnished silver pocket watch with a dirty microfiber cloth. He looked up as I approached, his dark eyes scanning my tailored jacket and polished shoes, quickly assessing my financial value. I did not offer a polite greeting or engage in small talk. I stated my business with absolute directness, demanding the immediate return of a specific vintage diamond necklace brought into his shop a few days prior by a young, frantic woman. The owner stopped wiping the watch, letting out a low, raspy chuckle that grated against the quiet room. He tossed the rag aside and leaned closer, resting his thick forearms on the glass. A smug, arrogant smile spread across his face, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. He confirmed that he knew exactly which flawless piece of jewelry I was talking about. He turned around, operating the mechanical dial of a heavy steel safe bolted to the back wall. He retrieved the dark mahogany box and snapped it open, dangling my late wife's diamonds under the harsh fluorescent light. The sight of Diane's necklace hanging from his greasy fingers sent a spike of cold fury through my chest, but I kept my physical reactions entirely suppressed. He placed the box on the counter, keeping his heavy hand firmly planted over the velvet lid. He aggressively informed me that business was simply business, and that he ran a legitimate enterprise, not a charity for careless families. He quoted a redemption price that was exactly triple the original appraisal value of the diamonds. He mockingly declared that the rules of the street were strictly finders keepers, and that if I wanted to buy back my precious family sentiments, I would have to pay the extreme premium tax. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, completely convinced he held all the negotiating leverage over a desperate, sentimental old man willing to empty his wallet for a piece of shiny glass. I did not reach for my wallet or attempt to negotiate his outrageous extortion attempt. I stared right through his smug facade, recognizing the exact same pathetic brand of baseless arrogance that had just sent my son-in-law to a federal penitentiary. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored jacket and slowly pulled out 2 crisp pieces of paper. I placed them deliberately on the scratched glass counter directly next to his heavy resting hand. The first document was a formally stamped and notarized police report explicitly detailing the grand larceny of the diamond necklace, complete with the exact serial numbers and insurance appraisals. The second item was a high-definition color photograph printed directly from my offshore cloud server. It was a perfectly clear still frame extracted from the hidden security camera footage. The image captured Kendra standing at this exact counter, sliding the stolen mahogany box across the glass, while the owner handed her a pathetic stack of $100 bills. The smug smile instantly slid off the owner's face. He stared down at the photograph, recognizing his own face caught in the act of facilitating a major felony. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the glass, and dropped my voice to a dangerous clinical whisper. I systematically outlined the severe federal penalties for knowingly receiving and trafficking stolen property across state lines. I casually mentioned that the woman in the photograph was currently deeply entangled in a massive federal wire fraud and money laundering investigation spearheaded by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I explained that possessing those diamonds made his shady pawn shop an active crime scene and a direct accessory to a major federal syndicate. I gave him a clear, absolute ultimatum. I told him he could either hand over the necklace immediately without a single word of protest, or I would make one phone call to my federal contacts and have his entire establishment raided and permanently boarded up before noon. The thick color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small behind his fortified counter. The arrogant posturing evaporated, instantly replaced by the raw, frantic terror of a petty criminal realizing he had just stepped into a massive federal crossfire. He did not ask for a single dollar. He snatched his hand away from the mahogany box as if the velvet were physically burning his skin. He shoved the jewelry case rapidly across the scratched glass, waving his hands frantically in the air, babbling rushed apologies and swearing he wanted absolutely no trouble with the federal authorities. I picked up the box, snapping the lid shut with a firm, satisfying click. I secured Diane's diamonds safely inside my jacket pocket and turned my back on the squalor of his shop. I pushed open the heavy, reinforced glass door and stepped out into the crisp, clean morning sunlight. The air felt fresh and entirely unburdened. The final piece of my late wife was safely back in my possession, and the absolute purge of every toxic element from my life was finally complete. Exactly 1 month passed since I walked out of that grimy pawn shop with Diane's necklace safely secured in my pocket. The heavy, suffocating fog that had settled over my property during Brent and Kendra's occupation was entirely gone. My home was completely restored to its original peaceful state. The broken crystal vase had been swept away, the scuff marks on the hardwood floor buffed out, and the heavy oak locks replaced with reinforced steel deadbolts. I stood in my pristine kitchen, listening to the comforting, steady drip of the coffee maker filling the glass carafe with a premium dark roast. The rich, earthy aroma filled the room, replacing the stale scent of desperation and panic that had clung to the walls. I grabbed 2 heavy ceramic mugs and walked slowly out onto the wide wrap-around front porch. The morning air was crisp and clear, the neighborhood bathed in bright, unyielding sunlight. Felix was already sitting in the wooden rocking chair across from me, his long legs stretched out comfortably. I handed my oldest friend a steaming mug of black coffee, taking my own seat in the wicker chair opposite him. We did not need to exchange pleasantries or fill the air with meaningless chatter. We were 2 old men who had successfully navigated a high-stakes war and lived to enjoy the absolute tranquility of the aftermath. The suburban street was quiet, save for the gentle rustle of the oak leaves in the breeze. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the intense heat warm my chest. The silence between us was not empty. It was thick with the profound, undeniable satisfaction of total victory. Felix reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a folded copy of the morning newspaper, dropping it flat onto the small wooden table between us. He tapped his index finger against a short column buried in the regional crime section. He took a sip of his coffee and casually delivered the final casualty report of the war we had waged. Brent had officially folded under the crushing weight of the federal evidence. Faced with the high-definition surveillance video of his own wire fraud and the absolute certainty of a 40-year sentence if he took the case to trial, he took the coward's way out. He signed a comprehensive plea agreement admitting full guilt to every single federal charge the Cybercrimes Division threw at him. The judge showed absolutely zero leniency for a man who attempted to launder millions to a sanctioned international entity. Brent was formally locked away in a maximum security federal penitentiary with a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 25 years. There would be no early parole, no appeals, and no desperate escape plans. His life was permanently reduced to a concrete cell and a steel-barred window. Felix then shifted his gaze, updating me on the pathetic remnants of my daughter's existence. The federal asset freeze had completely wiped Kendra out, leaving her absolutely destitute. She was currently working a grueling minimum wage shift at a greasy diner on the far edge of town, completely cut off from the luxury she had ruthlessly chased. Her sprawling suburban dream had been downsized to a cramped, decaying studio apartment situated above a noisy laundromat. She spent her days scrubbing tables and serving cheap coffee to strangers, completely stripped of her entitlement and her generational wealth. She had traded a loving father and a guaranteed multi-million-dollar inheritance for the false promises of a bankrupt criminal. The reality of her catastrophic choices was now her permanent, agonizing daily routine. She had no lawyers, no safety net, and absolutely no way back into my life. I listened to Felix relay the facts without a single ounce of pity or regret. The punishment flawlessly fit the crime. I lowered my gaze from the quiet street and looked down at the small wooden table resting between our chairs. Sitting squarely on top of the folded newspaper, holding the pages down against the morning breeze, was the pair of gold-framed reading glasses. They were completely unrecognizable from the pristine, expensive gift Brent had smugly handed me on Father's Day. I had taken a heavy steel hammer from my garage and systematically crushed the frames, shattering the microscopic pinhole camera and entirely obliterating the hidden audio transmitter. The twisted, jagged metal and splintered glass now functioned as a crude but highly effective paperweight. I stared at the ruined surveillance device, reflecting on the sheer magnitude of the ordeal. I had not merely survived an intricate assassination plot and a coordinated theft attempt. Survival implies a passive defensive stance. I had taken full control of the narrative from the very first moment Felix spotted the hidden lens. I did not rely on the slow, unpredictable machinery of the civil justice system or waste my breath arguing with people who viewed me as disposable. I weaponized their own boundless arrogance against them. I allowed their toxic greed to blind them completely, turning their invasive technology into the exact undeniable evidence needed to secure a federal conviction. I used their desperation as the primary building material to construct their inescapable cages. They thought they were hunting a frail, senile old man, but they had blindly walked straight into the jaws of a master engineer. The warm morning sun climbed higher into the sky, washing the front porch in a brilliant golden light. Felix finished the last drop of his coffee, gave me a silent, respectful nod, and stood up to head home. I remained seated in my wicker chair, letting the absolute, unbreakable silence of the property wrap around my shoulders like a heavy, comforting blanket. The war was definitively over, and the enemy had been completely eradicated from my existence. I set my ceramic mug down on the table right next to the shattered gold frames. I reached deep into my worn cotton shirt pocket and pulled out my real reading glasses. They were a cheap, flimsy pair of plastic frames I had purchased at the local pharmacy for $5. They possessed no hidden cameras, no audio bugs, and absolutely zero ulterior motives. I unfolded the plastic arms and slid them comfortably onto my face, adjusting the lenses to my failing eyesight. I picked up a thick, weathered novel I had been meaning to read for years and opened it to the very first page. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cool breeze against my face, and finally enjoyed my hard-won permanent peace. Looking back on the wreckage of what used to be my family, I realized that the most profound lesson hidden beneath the federal indictments and the shattered gold frames was not about offshore accounts or surveillance technology. The ultimate lesson I learned, and the one I hope everyone listening takes to heart, is about the terrifying illusion of unconditional loyalty and the absolute necessity of establishing impenetrable boundaries. For 70 years, I operated under the fundamental societal belief that blood ties were sacred and that biological connection automatically guaranteed a baseline of respect and devotion. I believed that because I had provided for my daughter, because I had clothed her, fed her, and protected her from the harsh realities of the world, she would naturally reciprocate that care when my own twilight years approached. That assumption is the single most dangerous trap a parent can ever fall into. Love must be a continuous, active exchange built on a foundation of mutual respect. When we give endlessly without requiring accountability, we do not build love. We build entitlement. Kendra did not view my sacrifices as acts of devotion. She viewed them as the standard operating procedure of a resource that existed solely to facilitate her comfort. When Brent entered the picture, he merely accelerated a rotting process that had already taken root in her character. This brings me to the second vital lesson regarding how society at large and predators specifically view the aging process. There is a pervasive, arrogant assumption that physical age correlates directly with cognitive decline and emotional weakness. Brent looked at my gray hair and my slower physical movements and immediately calculated that my intellect had eroded alongside my youth. He confused a quiet demeanor with a fading mind. He did not understand that true wisdom is the accumulation of decades of pattern recognition, behavioral analysis, and survival instinct. Aging does not erase a sharp mind, it simply teaches that mind to operate in absolute silence. I learned that the greatest strategic advantage you can ever possess is being entirely underestimated by your enemy. When they assume you are weak, they become lazy. They leave their plans exposed, they speak too loudly, and they execute their schemes with a sloppy, arrogant confidence. I use their ageist assumptions as the primary weapon against them. By playing the part of the confused, docile old man, I gave them the false sense of security they needed to completely incriminate themselves. If I had shouted or demanded respect, they would have raised their defenses. By giving them nothing but silence and apparent compliance, I allowed them to sprint blindly toward their own destruction. The third realization centers on the absolute corrosive nature of unearned wealth and desperate greed. Greed is not simply a desire for more money. It is a psychological disease that completely overrides logic, reasoning, and basic self-preservation. Brent was a man drowning in a $400,000 ocean of violent debt. He was a cornered animal, and his desperation made him incredibly predictable. I learned that you never have to force a greedy person into a trap. You only have to open the door and let their own appetite push them inside. The federal honeypot account was glaringly suspicious. A legitimate bank portal would never allow a $3 million international wire transfer to process without multiple layers of identity verification and secondary security clearances. A rational, cautious man would have seen the red flags and immediately walked away. But Brent was not rational. He was blinded by the 9-digit number flashing on the screen and the terrifying ticking clock of his loan sharks. His greed completely short-circuited his critical thinking skills. He wanted the money so badly that he willingly ignored every single warning sign, actively plunging his own head into the federal guillotine. Greed makes people stupid, and that stupidity is exactly what you must rely on when building your counterattack. Perhaps the most difficult but essential lesson I extracted from this entire ordeal was the absolute necessity of emotional detachment when dealing with toxic family members. When I first discovered the hidden camera inside the bridge of those gold-framed reading glasses, my initial biological response was a wave of agonizing heartbreak. I wanted to confront my daughter, shake her, and demand to know why she hated me enough to orchestrate such a vile violation of my privacy. But I quickly realized that emotional confrontation is the currency of manipulators. If I had shown them my pain, they would have weaponized it. They would have gaslighted me, played the victims, and twisted the narrative to make me feel guilty for suspecting them. I learned that silence is the most devastating response you can ever deliver to a narcissist. It deprives them of the emotional reaction they crave and leaves them entirely in the dark. The silent adjustment is not about suppressing your feelings. It is about compartmentalizing your rage and channeling it entirely into calculated surgical action. I did not waste a single breath arguing with Brent or Kendra about their morality. I let the federal task force, the local police, and the legal eviction notices do the talking for me. When you remove emotion from the equation, you protect your peace and you ensure your retaliation is flawless. This experience also fundamentally reshaped my understanding of what constitutes a true family. For decades, I prioritized my biological daughter over everything else, believing that my duty to her superseded my own happiness and security. But standing on my porch with Felix watching the morning sunrise over my reclaimed home, I realized that family is a conscious choice, not a genetic obligation. Felix was not bound to me by blood. He owed me nothing. Yet he risked his own safety, leveraged his federal contacts, and stood by my side through the darkest moments of this entire conflict without ever asking for a single thing in return. He proved that true loyalty is demonstrated through actions in the trenches of life, not through obligatory holiday visits or superficial gifts. I learned that it is entirely acceptable and deeply necessary to prune the dead branches from your family tree. Cutting off a toxic child is the ultimate taboo in our society, heavily judged and widely misunderstood. People will tell you that you must forgive because they are family. I learned that you must walk away precisely because they are family, and they use that sacred trust to inflict the deepest possible wounds. Forgiveness may cleanse the soul, but boundaries protect the life. I chose to protect my life. Furthermore, I learned the vital importance of financial secrecy and estate protection. The very fact that my daughter and her husband knew I had an offshore trust was the catalyst for their entire criminal enterprise. Wealth attracts parasites, and those parasites are most often the people sitting across from you at the dining room table. I realized that keeping your financial affairs absolutely private is not an act of deception. It is an act of essential self-defense. By creating a decoy safe and utilizing impenetrable corporate trusts, I ensured that my actual assets were shielded by layers of legal armor that a simple forged signature could never penetrate. It taught me that trust is something that must be continuously earned and verified, not blindly handed over simply because someone shares your last name. You must always maintain total, absolute control over your own resources until your final breath. To surrender that control is to surrender your autonomy, your dignity, and potentially your very life. The ordeal taught me that hitting rock bottom is sometimes the only way a person can truly understand the gravity of their actions. I could have easily paid off Brent's gambling debts and saved Kendra from eviction. I had the liquid capital to make their problems vanish instantly. But I learned that rescuing a manipulator from the consequences of their own actions only enables their destructive behavior. By refusing to catch them when they fell, I forced them to face the absolute brutal reality of the criminal choices they made. Brent is spending the next 25 years in a federal cage where his arrogance and his manipulative charm will count for absolutely nothing. Kendra is scrubbing diner tables, learning the agonizing cost of survival without a safety net. I did not destroy their lives. I simply stepped out of the way and let gravity do its job. It is a harsh lesson, but it is the only one that leaves a lasting impact. You cannot shield bad people from bad outcomes without becoming a victim of their collateral damage. Finally, I learned that true peace is incredibly expensive but entirely worth the cost. The tranquility I feel now sipping my dark roast coffee on my front porch reading my novels in the quiet afternoon light was paid for with the loss of my only child. It is a heavy price, but the alternative was spending my final years living as a hostage in my own home, constantly monitoring my food for sedatives and my belongings for hidden microphones. I chose the pain of isolation over the agony of betrayal. I chose my own dignity over a fabricated family dynamic. I learned that you are never too old to start completely over, to redefine your surroundings, and to ruthlessly eliminate anything that threatens your peace of mind. Life is far too short to spend it accommodating predators regardless of who they are or how long you have known them. You must protect your sanctuary with the ferocity of a soldier because no one else is going to protect it for you. If you are listening to this story and you recognize the signs in your own life, do not wait for the situation to escalate into a crisis. Pay attention to the disrespect. Notice the subtle boundary violations. Do not ignore the gut feeling that tells you something is deeply wrong with the people closest to you. Do not let anyone convince you that your age diminishes your value or your right to absolute respect. You have built your life through decades of hard work and sacrifice. You owe nothing to those who view you merely as a stepping stone to their own comfort. Protect your assets, protect your mind, and above all, protect your peace. Do not be afraid to enact your own silent adjustment. Walk away from the toxicity, cut the financial cords, and let the manipulators face the cold, harsh reality of the world without your endless support. You will find that the silence that follows the storm is the most beautiful sound you will ever hear. Did you like my story? And which city or country are you listening from today? I would love to know how far this message has traveled. So let us meet in the comments section below. Have you ever had to cut ties with a highly toxic family member to protect your own peace and sanity? Tell me your experiences and how you handled your own silent adjustments. If you found value in this story, you can support me by hitting the like button, leaving a super thanks, and sharing this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own strength. Thank you so much for your sweet support and your time today. I am looking forward to reading your comments on the story. On the screen right now, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There is so much more content on my channel designed to empower and inspire you. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. See you in the next life story with love and respect.